He never even said goodbye. The morning Vivian Ashcroft's fiancé disappeared, he left $43 on the nightstand of his hotel room. Not for her, but to cover his own unpaid tab, and walked out into the Nebraska dawn without a backward glance. The stage depot clerk would later say the man had been whistling. Actually whistling, like a man without a single weight on his soul, while somewhere across town, a woman in a blue traveling dress was pulling her last trunk down 3 flights of stairs, certain her future was waiting just around the corner. It wasn't. And the man who took everything she had, her money, her dignity, her faith in her own judgment, was already 40 miles gone before she even reached the depot. If you've ever been abandoned by someone you completely trusted, this story will reach straight into your chest. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this, and hit that like button while you're at it. Drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The depot at Caldwell Crossing wasn't much. A weathered platform, a bench with one broken leg propped up by a folded flour sack, and a small window where tickets were sold on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the stage actually ran on schedule, which was almost never. There was a water trough on the east side that smelled of iron and old mud, and a single cottonwood tree so old and twisted that the locals had stopped noticing it decades ago. Vivian Ashcroft noticed it on the first day because it was the only shade. She sat beneath it with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap the way her mother had taught her, because her mother had believed that a woman's posture announced her character before she ever opened her mouth. Vivian had believed that too once. She was finding it harder to hold on to such certainties now. She had 2 trunks. The larger one held her clothes, practical things, mostly, though she had allowed herself 3 good dresses because Douglas had written that Nebraska society was more refined than people assumed. The smaller trunk held her books, her correspondence files, her father's pocket watch, and the $312 that represented every remaining cent of her inheritance after the train tickets and the boarding house in Omaha and the stage fare west. Douglas had the rest. Not stolen, she had told herself on the first day. Invested. He had explained it carefully in his letters, his handwriting so precise and elegant that she had read each one 3 or 4 times just to admire the penmanship. The opportunity was time-sensitive, he had written. The land claim needed to be filed before another party moved on it. He would send for the money by wire the moment he arrived in Caldwell Crossing, and she was to follow on the next stage. She had wired the money. She had followed on the next stage. She was still following, except Douglas didn't seem to be in front of her anymore. The stage driver's name was Orville Potts, and he had the particular kind of sympathy that manifests as avoidance. He looked at Vivian the way a man looks at a dog limping along a road, aware of the suffering, unwilling to engage with it directly, quietly relieved that it isn't his problem. He'd seen her kind before. Not her exactly, but women like her. Educated women from cities who came west on the strength of letters and promises, only to discover that paper and ink could say absolutely anything. On the first day, Orville had told her the connecting stage sometimes ran late. On the second day, he'd mentioned that roads north of the Cimarron could wash out this time of year. On the third day, he'd found something urgently important to do on the far side of the depot whenever Vivian looked in his direction. On the fourth day, he walked across the platform, sat down on the bench beside her, the broken leg side, which tilted him at an uncomfortable angle, and looked out at the prairie for a long moment before he spoke. Miss Ashcroft. Mr. Potts. I need to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you ahead of time not to cry, because I'm genuinely terrible when women cry, and I will be of absolutely no use to you. Vivian turned to look at him. Up close, Orville Potts had the face of a man who had spent 30 years squinting into wind. His eyes were pale blue and deeply uncomfortable. All right, she said carefully. He cleared his throat. He looked at the cottonwood. He looked at the water trough. He looked briefly at the sky, as though hoping for divine guidance, and then apparently gave up on that avenue. He's not coming back, Orville said. The words landed in Vivian's chest like something thrown hard from a short distance. Not a surprise exactly. She'd been constructing increasingly elaborate explanations for Douglas's absence all week, and somewhere beneath all those explanations she had known, in the way you know a tooth is going bad before you're willing to admit it, that something was deeply wrong. Knowing something and hearing it said out loud were 2 entirely different experiences, though. Hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that knowing never quite did. You've seen this before, she said. It wasn't a question. Orville looked at his boots. 3 times. 3 times. 4 if you count the widow from Cincinnati, but that situation had some additional complications that make it not quite a fair comparison. He paused. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. It's all right. Vivian's voice was steady. She was distantly aware that this steadiness was not genuine composure, but something more like shock, the particular numbness that sets in when the mind decides that the incoming information is too large to process all at once and begins rationing it. What do you know about him? Orville shifted on the tilted bench. His name isn't Douglas Fairfield. I suspected as much. Most women don't. He stopped. Started again. His real name, far as anyone can piece together, is probably Clarence Dutton, though he's used at least 6 names that I've heard of. There may be more. He moves around. He targets women with money. Women who are... He seemed to be choosing his words with great care. Women who are educated and capable, and who would be embarrassed to report being deceived because they think it reflects poorly on their judgment. Vivian thought about that. She thought about the $312 in her small trunk and the considerably larger amount that was now somewhere west of nowhere with a man named Clarence Dutton. She thought about her apartment in Boston, which she had given up. She thought about her position at Hargrove & Sons accounting firm, which she had resigned. She thought about the carefully composed letter she had written to her cousin Margaret, explaining that she was moving west to be married and would not require the use of Margaret's guest room this Christmas. Well, she said. Yeah, said Orville. They sat in silence for a moment. The cottonwood moved slightly in a wind that didn't seem strong enough to move anything. What are my options? Vivian asked. Orville scratched the back of his neck. The eastbound stage runs Friday. That's 3 days. There's a boarding house in town, Mrs. Hensley's place. She's decent enough. You'd need to pay in advance, but how much does the eastbound ticket cost? He told her. Vivian did the arithmetic. 3 nights at Mrs. Hensley's, the eastbound ticket to Omaha, the train fare from Omaha back to Boston. She wouldn't have enough. She'd have enough to get to Omaha. Maybe. She'd have to wire her cousin Margaret for the rest, and Margaret would wire back the money along with a letter that would be kind in the way that made you feel smaller than outright contempt. And Vivian would spend the entire journey home understanding, with increasing clarity, that this was a story she would spend years not telling. I see, she said. I'm real sorry, Miss Ashcroft. Yes. She looked out at the prairie. It was a remarkable piece of landscape, she thought, vast in a way that Boston's busy streets never permitted you to perceive. The sky out here didn't end. It simply continued until you gave up trying to find where it stopped. Under other circumstances, she thought she might have found it beautiful. Thank you for telling me, Mr. Potts. Orville stood up, grateful to be released. He made it almost to the depot door before he stopped and turned back. There was a man in town this morning asking after the Fairfield situation, he said, using the false name with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned that accuracy sometimes matters less than tact. Came in from the North Range, big fella, quiet type. Didn't say much except that he knew something about the man you were waiting for. He hesitated. I don't know his business, and I'm not vouching for him. I just thought you ought to know. Vivian turned to look at him. What was his name? Shaw, Gideon Shaw. She didn't have to wait long. He came around the south corner of the depot building about 20 minutes later, and Vivian's first impression was that he moved very quietly for someone his size. Not sneaking, nothing furtive about it, but with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have spent years doing physical work in spaces where extra movement costs something. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been weather-tested thoroughly and had mostly passed. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years past that. He stopped about 10 feet away from her, holding his hat in both hands, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity. Not the complicated blend of curiosity and condescension she'd been receiving from passers-by all week. Something more cautious than either of those things. More careful. Miss Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Shaw. He looked at the cottonwood for a moment. She was starting to feel like the tree had some significance she wasn't aware of. Potts said I could speak with you. He did. I'll understand if you'd rather not. You've had a considerable amount of strangers inserting themselves into your situation this week, and I imagine not all of it has been welcome. Vivian studied him. There was something deliberate about the way he'd phrased that, the acknowledgement that her comfort mattered, offered without making a performance of it. You knew something about Douglas Fairfield, she said, or whatever his name actually is. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. Clarence Dutton, he said. That's the name I know him by. He's used others. Fairfield, Hartwell, Beaumont. He seems to favor names that sound like old Eastern money. That's accurate. She paused. How do you know him? He looked at the hat in his hands, turned it once, slowly, by the brim. My sister, he said. Her name was Clara. She was 22 years old. He stopped, started again, more carefully. She answered an advertisement in a Cincinnati paper. A man named Elliot Beaumont was seeking a correspondence partner with an eye toward marriage. He was apparently charming in letters. He is, Vivian said. Very. She was smart. Smarter than me, honestly, and I'm not saying that to be kind. She genuinely was. She could add a column of numbers in her head faster than most men could do it on paper. But she was also young, and she wanted things, a future, a family. She wanted to be in a place where being clever meant something. He paused. He convinced her to come west. She wired him the bulk of her savings, money she'd been keeping back from her wages for 3 years, and she came west and she waited, and he didn't come. How long did she wait? 10 days. Gideon's voice had gone very level, the kind of level that takes effort. She didn't have enough money to get home, and she was too proud to wire me for help because she'd written me a letter telling me she was getting married, and I'd written back that I thought it was too fast, and she should be careful, and she didn't want to admit I'd been right. He turned the hat again. She found work at a laundry in a town called Morrow's Creek. The conditions were... He stopped. She got sick. By the time I found out and got there, she'd been sick for 6 weeks. She died 3 days after I arrived. Vivian said nothing for a moment. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwood. I'm sorry, she said. That was 4 years ago. He finally looked up from the hat. I've been looking for Dutton, or Fairfield, or whoever he's calling himself, ever since. Potts sends word when he sees something that fits the pattern. He paused. That's how I knew to come. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of several things simultaneously, that this story was either true or an extraordinarily well-constructed lie, that she was currently in a position where her ability to distinguish between those two possibilities had been seriously called into question, and that despite all of this, something in Gideon Shaw's delivery, the flat economy of it, the places where he stopped and recalibrated, felt different from Douglas's elegant letters in a way she couldn't quite articulate but couldn't quite dismiss. What do you want? She asked. Honestly? He glanced away, then back. I'm not sure yet. I came because Potts said a woman was waiting, and I thought I should, I don't know, make sure you were all right, tell you what I knew. He paused, and maybe ask if you'd be willing to talk about him, where you met him, how the correspondence went, whether there were details that might help me find him. You want information. I want to find him. Yes. He met her eyes steadily. I also want to make sure you have somewhere to go that isn't a ditch. The bluntness of that last part surprised her into something very close to a laugh. She managed to keep it from actually becoming one, but it was a near thing. I have $312, she said, which is not precisely a ditch. More than Clara had when she got off the stage. He said it without softening it, which she found, oddly, more comforting than softening it would have been. Do you have somewhere to go? I have options. That's a different question. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The sun was getting low behind him, and the light was doing something complicated with the grass, turning it colors that had no good names in any language she'd been taught. I was a bookkeeper, she said, in Boston, 6 years. I managed accounts for a trading firm. I am competent with ledgers and correspondence, and I can learn most organizational systems quickly. She paused. I'm telling you this because I assume you're about to offer me something, and I'd prefer the offer to be based on accurate information. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything she had a ready name for. I run a cattle operation north of here, he said. About 12 miles. I don't have a bookkeeper. I've been doing the accounting myself and I do it badly. He paused. I can offer wages, a private room in the main house, and the understanding that the arrangement is professional and nothing else. No one will expect anything from you that isn't in the job description. And the job description is bookkeeping. Bookkeeping. Correspondence, if you're willing, possibly some help organizing the supply orders, which are currently in a condition I'd describe as chaotic. Vivian looked at the depot. She looked at her 2 trunks. She looked at the twisted cottonwood and the long, flat nothing of the prairie. And then she looked back at Gideon Shaw, standing 10 feet away with his hat in his hands, waiting. You said you want to find him, she said. I do. So do I. She said it very quietly, but without any hesitation. I want to find him too. Gideon looked at her for a moment. That could be dangerous. Yes, she agreed. I expect it could be. Another pause. The hat turned once more in his hands. All right, he said finally. Then we should probably get your trunks loaded before it gets dark. The ride north took the better part of 2 hours, most of it in the particular silence that settles between strangers who have said something important but aren't sure yet what to do with it. Gideon drove the wagon. Vivian sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and watched the land go by. The ranch appeared out of the dimming light like something that had always been there and was simply waiting to be found. Not grand, she hadn't expected grand, but solid. The main house was timber and stone, 2 stories, with a broad porch along the front that had clearly been repaired several times in several different styles, suggesting a building that had been lived in hard and maintained honestly. There were outbuildings, a barn, corrals holding cattle that moved and breathed in the near dark like dark water, lights in several windows. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up, older, wiry, with a face like old leather and eyes that assessed Vivian in about 3 seconds and apparently decided she was acceptable. This the Boston woman? He said to Gideon. Harlan, this is Miss Vivian Ashcroft. She'll be handling the books. The books are a disaster, Harlan said to Vivian directly, without apology. He's been entering expenses in the wrong columns for 8 months, and he knows it, and he won't admit it. I entered them in the column I thought was right, Gideon said. The column said livestock, and you put the lumber costs in it. Lumber is for the livestock facilities. Vivian looked at Gideon. Do you have the ledgers? In the study. I'll start tomorrow morning. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Her boots hit the hard ground and she took a moment to feel the solidity of it, something that wasn't moving, wasn't a stage or a train or a bench with a broken leg. Tonight, I'd like to see my room, if that's all right, and I'd like a glass of water and somewhere to be alone for about an hour. There was a brief silence. Then Harlan looked at Gideon and said, low enough that he probably thought Vivian couldn't hear, She'll do. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a short hall, with a window that faced east. There was a bed with a quilt that had been patched in 4 places and was the more honest for it, a washstand, a chair, a small table. Someone had left a pitcher of water and a cup on the table, which was either standard practice or Harlan's version of hospitality, and she drank the whole pitcher sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not cry. She had a strict policy against crying in new places, because crying in a new place meant you'd given the place permission to make you feel small, and she wasn't prepared to give this place permission to do anything just yet. She needed more information first. She thought about Douglas, about the letters, the careful handwriting, the way he'd described Nebraska in terms that made it sound like something from a novel. She thought about the wired money and the empty depot and Orville Potts's pale blue eyes, and the particular shame of being wrong about something you'd staked everything on. She thought about Gideon's sister, Clara, adding columns in her head faster than most men could do on paper, dying in a laundry town 6 weeks after a man had failed to show up. She thought about what Harlan had said. She'll do. In the morning, she found the ledgers. They were in the study off the main room, stacked on a table beside a cold fireplace. 6 of them, spanning the past 4 years, in 3 different handwriting styles that suggested Gideon had taken over from someone else midway through and then apparently worked through 2 different systems before settling on what appeared to be a bespoke organizational logic that made sense to no one but himself. The lumber in the livestock column was only the beginning. There were supply costs listed under revenue. There were labor wages split across 3 different entries with no clear notation explaining the splits. There were 2 columns that appeared to track the same thing under different names, neither of which was accurate. Vivian sat down, opened the most recent ledger, and began at the beginning. She was still there 2 hours later when Gideon appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He looked at the ledgers spread around her and at the notes she'd been making and at the expression on her face, which she suspected was more honest than she intended. "That bad?" he said. "It's coherent," she said carefully. "It's just coherent in a way that's specific to you and doesn't correspond to any standard system." "Is that a polite way of saying it's wrong?" "It's a polite way of saying it works for you and will need to be translated." She accepted the coffee. "The underlying data is all there. Nothing's missing. You just filed it in places that would take a stranger some time to find." He sat down in the chair across the table, wrapping both hands around his cup. He looked at the ledgers the way a man looks at something he's done that he knows wasn't his best work. "I'll admit I was better at cattle than accounting. That's not a failing. They're different skills." She turned a page. "I'll need about a week to establish a baseline and reconcile the last 8 months. After that, I can set up a system that will make the ongoing entries straightforward." "Whatever you need." She looked up at him. "I want to find him, Mr. Shaw." He met her eyes. "I know. I want to be useful to that effort, not just kept somewhere safe while you do the actual work." She set her pen down. "I can write letters. I knew his methods. I was on the receiving end of them for 7 months. I know exactly the kind of woman he targets and exactly the kind of thing he says." She paused. "I could write as a target, carefully, if we knew where he was operating." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant risk." "It is," she agreed. "I'm aware of that." She picked the pen back up. "I'm not proposing we do it tomorrow. I'm proposing that it's an option we should consider seriously." She turned back to the ledger. "For now, I'm going to fix your books." He watched her for a moment more, then stood, taking his coffee with him toward the door. "Miss Ashcroft." She looked up. "The room at the end of the hall is yours as long as you want it. That's not contingent on anything. If you work here for 30 years or if you decide to leave Friday, the arrangement stands." He paused, and she had the impression he'd prepared this speech and was delivering it exactly as planned. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me something that would affect your judgment. About anything." Vivian looked at him steadily. "I don't feel that way." "Good." He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Good." He left, and she listened to his footsteps move down the hall, and then she turned back to the ledgers and the long, careful work of making sense out of what someone else had left behind. Outside the east window, the Nebraska morning was coming in clear and wide, and the prairie went all the way to the edge of what could be seen, and somewhere out there, a man named Clarence Dutton was writing careful letters to women who wanted to believe in him. Not for much longer, Vivian thought. She dipped her pen and kept working. 3 days into her accounting work, she found the discrepancy that wasn't a mistake. She almost missed it. It was buried in the second ledger, 18 months back, in an entry for a livestock purchase from a seller identified only by initials. The amount was larger than the surrounding entries, but not conspicuously so. What made her stop was the date. It matched, almost precisely, with a notation in a separate column that appeared to track something Gideon had labeled Other, a catch-all category he'd used for expenses that didn't fit cleanly elsewhere. She pulled both ledgers open side by side and looked at the 2 entries for a long moment. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. He was in the barn, doing something complicated with a piece of harness equipment that appeared to be fighting back. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "The entry's in the second ledger," she said. 18 months ago. Livestock purchase, JM, $640. He set the harness down. His face had changed slightly in the way she was beginning to recognize. A tightening, a shift toward careful neutrality. "That wasn't livestock," she said. "No. It was something else. It was money I paid to a man in Topeka who said he knew where Dutton was operating." He paused. "He didn't. Or if he did, he took the money and decided not to tell me." Vivian looked at him. "How many times have you done that?" A pause that lasted just slightly too long. "A few." "How many is a few?" He looked out the barn window at the clear Nebraska sky. 4 separate payments, over 4 years. Total of about $1,200. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Gideon? It was the first time she'd used his given name, and she wasn't entirely sure why she'd done it now, only that the last name seemed too formal for what she wanted to say. These men who took your money, did any of them produce anything? One gave me a name. The name turned out to be a dead end. A name he could have known without actually knowing Dutton's location. Yes, he said it flatly. I know what you're about to say. You've been paying people for information that doesn't lead anywhere, she said, and they know you'll pay because they know why you're looking, and a man with grief and enough money is not a man who makes careful decisions about what he's buying. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, that's fair. I'm not criticizing you. It sounded a little like criticism. I'm establishing facts. She leaned against the barn door frame. You have been trying to find him alone, using methods that are emotionally driven and therefore exploitable. That is factual, not critical. She paused. You need a different approach. I know that. My approach, she said carefully, is to think like he does. He doesn't come to his targets directly. He creates conditions that make them come to him. He writes letters that make a woman feel seen and specific and special, like he noticed something about her that no one else had ever noticed. She looked at her own hands for a moment, at the ink stains on her right index finger from 3 days of ledger work. He's very good at it. I read his letters 6 times each. I still believe them. He's had practice. He has, which means he has patterns, and patterns can be predicted. She looked up. I want to write a letter. Gideon went very still. Not now, she said. I don't know where he is. But when we find out where he's operating, and we will find out, because he can't stay still long, he needs new territory and new targets too regularly. I want to write a letter that will bring him to us. She held his gaze. He will recognize a certain kind of woman as ideal, educated, alone. Some money, but not so much that she'd have significant legal resources. He'll recognize the profile because he built it himself. She paused. I fit the profile perfectly. That's exactly why it's dangerous. Yes, she said simply. It is. I'd still like to do it. He looked at her for a long time. The barn was quiet except for the shifting of horses in their stalls, and somewhere distant the particular lonely sound of wind finding a gap in old boards. Let me think about it, he said finally. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no, and Vivian had spent enough years in accounting to know that the numbers that mattered most were the ones that hadn't been entered yet. She went back to the ledgers. Harlan found her there an hour later and set a plate of biscuits on the corner of the table without being asked, and without commenting on them, and without waiting to be thanked, which she found, unexpectedly, to be one of the most comfortable things that had happened to her since she'd stepped off the stage at Caldwell Crossing. He'll come around, Harlan said, on his way out. She wasn't sure if he meant Gideon agreeing to the plan or something else entirely. With Harlan, it was difficult to tell. He communicated largely in partial statements that you were expected to complete yourself, which was either a character trait or a test she hadn't quite figured out yet. All right, she said. Good biscuits, he said. Thank you. He left, and she ate one and turned the page and kept working because the work was what she had right now. And she had learned very young that the only reliable cure for fear was to put your hands on something and make it better than it was. The ledgers were getting better. Everything else, she thought, watching the afternoon light move across the study floor, would follow in time. The biscuits. Harlan left on the corner of the table became a daily thing, though neither of them ever acknowledged the arrangement directly. He would appear sometime in the mid-morning, set the plate down without comment, and leave before Vivian had a chance to say anything beyond a brief thank you. It was the kind of consideration that operated below the level of conversation, and she found herself relying on it in ways she didn't entirely understand. The ledgers took 9 days instead of the week she'd estimated, partly because the third book turned out to contain a second hidden layer of notation she hadn't initially caught, small penciled numbers in the margins that corresponded to a separate tracking system Gideon had apparently invented and then forgotten about, and partly because she kept finding herself reading entries that told her things about the man who'd made them. Not financial things, human things. The way the handwriting changed after the date that would have corresponded, roughly, with Clara's death. How it got smaller and more cramped for about 6 months, and then gradually, slowly, opened back up again. How he'd paid a church in Morrow's Creek She assumed it was a church. The entry said only MC burial arrangement, an amount that would have been significant on a working rancher's income in a year when beef prices were low. She didn't mention any of this. It wasn't her business. On the 10th, she placed the completed reconciliation on the study table, along with 4 pages of notes explaining the new system she'd established, the categories she'd created, and where each type of expense should be entered going forward. She had also appended a 1-page summary of what the last 8 months of finances actually looked like once the entries were correctly organized, which was meaningfully better than the picture the scrambled ledgers had suggested. Gideon read through it at the table while she drank her coffee by the window. It took him a while. He was thorough, she had noticed, in the way that people are thorough when they've been burned by moving too fast. "We're doing better than I thought," he said finally. "You're doing considerably better than you thought," she said. The lumber that went into the livestock column was actually a legitimate improvement to the facilities, and there's an argument that the increased capacity has contributed to the revenue gains in the fourth quarter. I noted it in the appendix. He looked at the appendix. "You wrote an appendix." It seemed useful. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much did your firm in Boston pay you?" She told him. He named a figure that was $12 a month higher. "That work for you?" She had expected to negotiate. She had prepared several reasonable arguments about market rates and regional cost adjustments, and had not expected to need any of them. "Yes," she said. "That works." He nodded, still reading the appendix. "There's a letter." She had wondered when this would come. "From?" "A man named Terrence Wills. He runs a trading post in a town called Bitter Creek, about 60 miles west. He sent me letters 3 times in the past 2 years claiming he has information about Dutton." Gideon set the financial papers down and picked up an envelope from under the ledger stack. He held it out without crossing the distance between them, waiting for her to come and take it. "I've never responded. After the 4 payments that went nowhere, I decided I was done paying for information I couldn't verify." Vivian took the envelope. The letter inside was written in a hand that was educated but hurried, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had learned proper penmanship and then developed a bad habit of writing faster than they could maintain it. The date was 3 weeks prior. She read it twice. "He claims Dutton passed through Bitter Creek 6 weeks ago," she said, "under the name Hartwell. That's one of the names I know. He says a woman followed him west, a schoolteacher from Missouri, and that she's currently in Bitter Creek waiting for him." She lowered the letter. Either the woman is still there, or she's figured out what happened and left. Either way, if Dutton was in Bitter Creek 6 weeks ago and is now gone, he's somewhere between there and wherever he's going next. Which tells us very little specific. It tells us he's moving west. She folded the letter back into its envelope. "He always moves west, doesn't he? New territory. New women who haven't heard his name." Gideon leaned back in his chair. It was an old chair, wide-armed and slightly uneven, and he had the look of a man who had sat in it for many years working through difficult things. He was in Topeka 2 years ago, Wichita before that, based on what I could piece together. Bitter Creek fits the pattern. He's moving west and slightly north, which means he'll surface somewhere along that line. Vivian looked at the letter again. "Mr. Shaw." "Gideon," he said. "You've been saying Gideon for a week and then correcting yourself. Just say it." She looked up. I was watching her with an expression that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who noticed things and chose, most of the time, not to say them directly. "Gideon," she said, "I want to write to the school teacher in Bitter Creek." A pause. "Why?" "Because she's either still there, humiliated and stranded and probably furious, or she's gone home, humiliated and broke and probably furious. Either way, she knows things about him that I don't. The approach he used this time, the specific promises he made, whether anything was different from the pattern you know." She set the letter on the table between them. "And because she might be willing to help." "Help how?" "2 women who know his methods are significantly more dangerous to him than one." She sat down across the table, and she was aware of speaking more directly than she usually allowed herself, pushing past the careful professional register she'd been maintaining for 10 days. "He relies on isolation. Each woman believes she's the only one he's ever done this to, because if they compared notes, the whole mechanism falls apart. That's why he keeps moving. That's why he uses different names." She looked at Gideon steadily. He's vulnerable to exactly one thing: women who find each other and talk. Gideon looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Write to her. She wrote the letter that afternoon, sitting at the same study table with the window open and the smell of hay and turned earth coming in from outside. She drafted it 3 times before she was satisfied. The tone was the difficult part. She needed it to feel honest without being so raw that it frightened the woman into silence, and sympathetic without the condescension that sympathy could easily tip into. What she settled on was plain and direct. I believe we may have encountered the same man under different names. I am living and working in Nebraska and would value your account of your experience if you are willing to share it. You owe me nothing. I'm asking because I believe understanding is better than wondering, and because I suspect you have questions I might be able to answer. She signed it with her real name. She gave it to Harlan to post when he made the supply run to town, and then she went back to work and tried not to think too much about whether the school teacher would write back. She thought about it quite a bit. The ranch hands were a different kind of complication. There were 4 of them. Pete, who was young and earnest and had a habit of starting sentences without knowing how they'd end. Tom Greer, who was older and said almost nothing and clearly preferred it that way. A man everyone called Boots for reasons that had apparently been explained at some point in the past and were now simply accepted as settled truth. And a teenager named Willie, who had showed up 3 months ago looking for work and had been given it, and had not yet, as far as Vivian could tell, been given a clear explanation of what his actual job was. He seemed to do whatever needed doing, which meant he did quite a lot. They treated her, initially, with the specific careful neutrality that working men extend to women in unfamiliar situations. Not rude, not warm, simply watchful. She was aware of being assessed without being able to observe the assessment directly. They were polite at meals and gave her a wide path when she crossed the yard. What changed things was the supply order. She'd been working on it for 2 days, cross-referencing Gideon's previous orders against the current inventory she'd made with Willie's help. Willie had been assigned to assist her without being told why, and had accepted this assignment with the adaptable cheerfulness of someone accustomed to not being told why. And when she'd finished, she brought the completed order to Gideon in the barn and put it on the workbench in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at the previous order, which he still had folded in his back pocket. He looked at her order again. You cut $40 off the total, he said. I found 3 items on the standard order that you've been consistently overbuying. The surplus is sitting in the second storage room going to waste. I also found a supplier in Wichita who carries the same fencing wire at a better rate if you order in larger quantities, which I've included because the larger quantity will actually still be cheaper than the smaller quantity you've been ordering locally. He was quiet for a moment. Pete was doing something behind them in the stall, and Vivian could feel, without looking, that he had slowed down to listen. Anything else? Gideon said. The grain storage arrangement is inefficient. If you move the older stock forward consistently, you'd lose less to spoilage. I can write up how to do it, or I can explain it to whoever handles that. Willie handles that. I'll explain it to Willie. Gideon looked at her with that almost not quite a smile expression again. All right, he said. She explained it to Willie that afternoon, and Willie absorbed it with the quick, practical intelligence of someone who has learned that the way to stay employed is to understand things correctly the first time. He rearranged the grain storage in about an hour and a half, and then stood back and looked at his work and said, to no one in particular, that's better. After that, the careful neutrality from the ranch hands shifted gradually into something more comfortable. Not familiarity, not yet, but a kind of acceptance. She was useful, and usefulness, out here, was a more straightforward currency than most of what she'd dealt with in Boston. Tom Greer told her, at the end of the second week, without preamble or apparent reason, good books. Then he walked away. She took it as the equivalent of a standing ovation. The letter from Bitter Creek arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after she'd sent hers. The schoolteacher's name was Ruth Calloway, and she wrote the way she probably taught, precise, organized, with none of the apologetic hedging that women of that era were often expected to perform when talking about having been deceived. Ruth Calloway was not apologetic. She was, if the letter was an accurate reflection, thoroughly and specifically angry, in the focused way of someone who has moved past the humiliation stage and arrived at the more energizing territory of wanting to do something about it. She was still in Bitter Creek. She had found work as a teacher at a small school outside town. The actual teaching variety, which she noted with dry understatement, had turned out to be more readily available in Nebraska than the marriage she'd been promised. She had $41 left. She had not written to her family in Missouri because her family in Missouri had warned her against this exact situation, and she could not face the particular quality of their concern. What she knew about the man she'd called Elliot Hartwell: he had brown hair and gray eyes, and was approximately 5 feet 11 inches, and moved with the confident looseness of someone comfortable in almost any setting. He had a scar on the back of his right hand, small, crescent-shaped, possibly a burn. He preferred to operate through written correspondence for as long as possible before meeting in person, which she now understood was by design. The letters allowed him to construct an ideal version of himself that the actual meeting would inevitably complicate. He had claimed to be a land investor. He had mentioned twice a sister he was devoted to, which Ruth now noted with considerable bitterness was probably calculated to make him seem emotionally available while simultaneously providing a ready excuse for sudden departures. He had left Bitter Creek moving north. A trader who came through 2 weeks after had mentioned a man fitting the description in a town called Hayward's Ford, though under what name he couldn't say. Vivian read the letter twice and then took it to Gideon. He read it standing in the doorway of the study, one hand braced on the frame, and she watched his face as he got to the part about the scar and recognized something there. A confirmation, she guessed, of a detail he'd known or suspected. "The scar," she said. Clara mentioned it in a letter. He didn't look up from Ruth's handwriting. She thought it made him look interesting. She wrote... He stopped, started again. She wrote that scars meant a man had lived in the world, that it was proof he wasn't made of paper. Vivian said nothing. He finished the letter and handed it back. Hayward's Ford. It's north of Bitter Creek, fits the pattern. She took the letter carefully. I want to invite her here. Gideon looked at her. Ruth Calloway. I want to write and ask if she'd be willing to come to the ranch. She held his eyes. She's been in Bitter Creek for 3 months, with $41 and a teaching job she didn't come west to do, and she's angry enough to be useful. She knows details about him that I don't. And... She paused, choosing the next part carefully. She's exactly the right kind of woman. If we're going to write letters that bring him to us, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and a second woman who actually experienced his approach can help me calibrate what I write. She's a stranger. So was I 3 weeks ago. He looked at the letter again, though she'd already taken it back. You'd share your room? There's the small room off the kitchen that's been used for storage. It would take a day to clear. He was quiet for a moment. Write to her. She wrote to Ruth that evening. The reply came back in less than 2 weeks, which suggested Ruth had been ready to leave Bitter Creek for some time. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon on the stage from Wichita, carrying 1 small trunk and a leather satchel, and the expression of a woman who has decided that the best response to an undignified situation is to be absolutely dignified about everything else. She was small and dark-haired and sharp-eyed, maybe 30 years old, and she shook Vivian's hand with the firm grip of someone who had learned that women who shook hands like they meant it were taken more seriously. You're the bookkeeper, Ruth said. Yes, and you're the school teacher. For now. Ruth looked at the ranch, the barn, the outbuildings, the main house with its patchwork porch. It's real, she said, with a note of surprise she didn't bother to hide. What did you expect? I'm not sure. Another stage depot, maybe. She looked at Vivian. When you wrote, I wondered if it was another scheme. I almost didn't come. What changed your mind? You used your real name, Ruth said. People running schemes don't use their real names. She picked up her satchel. Show me where I'm sleeping, and then let's talk about Clarence Dutton. They talked about Clarence Dutton for most of that first evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, while Harlan did his deliberate best to be elsewhere, and Gideon sat at the far end of the table, mostly listening, occasionally asking a question. What came out of it was both more and less than Vivian had expected. Ruth had been corresponding with Dutton, Hartwell, for 5 months before coming west. In that time he had written 42 letters. She had kept them all, in a bundle tied with kitchen string, and she put them on the table now. I counted, she said, without particular emotion. I know that sounds... I counted. I kept mine too, Vivian said. I didn't count them. 70, give or take, Gideon said quietly. Both women looked at him. Clara kept hers, he said. I read them after. I counted. He looked at the table. He writes a lot of letters in the early months. Then it tapers. By the end, there were weeks between each one, and she was explaining the gaps to herself, finding reasons. The room was quiet for a moment. He has a pattern, Ruth said. She was already sorting through her letters, and Vivian recognized the motion, the particular focused efficiency of someone converting grief into work. First month, 2 or 3 letters a week. He asks questions, lots of questions, very specific ones. What kind of books do you like? What do you find difficult? What's something you're proud of? Things that make you feel seen, noticed. And then you answer, Vivian said. And then you answer, and the next letter reflects your answers back at you. Not obviously. He doesn't just repeat what you said, he weaves it in. He mentioned a book I'd referenced 3 letters earlier, like he'd been thinking about it the whole time in between. She paused. And by then you're writing a version of yourself that you like, Vivian said, because he keeps asking questions that draw out the best parts. And then he responds to those parts, like they're the whole of you. Ruth looked at her. Yes, exactly. And when someone treats you like your best self is your whole self, Vivian said, you start to believe it, and you don't want to do anything that would make them stop. Gideon was watching her with an expression she couldn't read from where she sat. He's not interested in who you actually are, Vivian continued. He's building an attachment. The questions aren't curiosity, they're inventory. Ruth picked up one of the letters from the middle of the bundle and held it toward the lamp. He wrote something in this one that I've thought about 100 times since. She read it to herself for a moment. Then, he wrote, I won't read it exactly, but he wrote that he'd spoken to many women over the years and found himself consistently disappointed by their lack of ambition. That I was different, that he thought a woman who knew what she wanted was worth crossing any distance to find. He said something almost identical to me, Vivian said. Different wording. He told Clara, Gideon said, that she was the first woman he'd met who made him feel like staying put. His voice was very flat. That he'd been a wanderer all his life, and he'd never understood men who wanted to be settled until he read her first letter. The 3 of them were quiet. He tailors it, Ruth said finally. He finds the specific thing each woman most wants to hear, and then he says it. Which means we have to find the specific thing he wants to hear, Vivian said. And then we say that. She had been building toward this since the evening she'd first proposed it to Gideon, and now with Ruth across the table and the lamp burning low and the letters spread between them, she felt the shape of it more clearly than she had before. Not just a plan, a mirror. They would use his own method against him. The careful questions, the constructed intimacy, the portrait of a woman that was real enough to be convincing and vulnerable enough to be attractive to what he was actually hunting. I know what he wants, she said. A woman with some money who is too embarrassed to fight back. Someone educated enough to be credible, but isolated enough to have no one to check his story against. She looked at Ruth. I want to write to him. A letter that he'll believe came from exactly that woman. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. You know where he is? Hayward's Ford, probably, or somewhere along that line. She looked at Gideon. You know people who know that territory. I can find out, he said. Then we find out. And I write. She looked down at the letters on the table. Ruth's 42, Clara's 70, the careful architecture of manipulation spread out under the lamplight. He spent years learning how to read women. What he's never had to consider is a woman who has already read him. Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning one of the letters over in her hands. Then she set it down carefully, face down, and looked at Vivian. Tell me what to write, she said. We write it together. Vivian pulled a blank sheet from the stack she'd been using for the account notes. But first I need you to tell me everything you know, every detail, the way he phrases things, the specific words he uses when he's building trust, the things he says about himself. She picked up her pen. Because we're not just writing a letter, we're building a version of ourselves that he won't be able to resist. Gideon stood up from the far end of the table. He took the lamp to refill it without being asked, and when he came back and set it down, the light was steadier than before. He sat back down and said nothing. But he stayed. And Vivian, who had been paying attention to such things since the night she arrived, noted that Gideon Shaw staying when he didn't have to was its own kind of statement, even if neither of them was prepared yet to say what it was. Outside, the Nebraska night had settled in fully, cold and wide, and full of the particular silence of a place where the nearest other people were a significant distance away. The lamp threw a circle of warmth across the table, across the letters, and the blank page and the two women sitting across from each other, building something careful and dangerous out of the only materials available to them, the truth about what had been done to them, and the willingness to do something about it. The first draft of the letter took 3 hours and was wrong in almost every way. The second draft was closer. By the fourth draft, somewhere past midnight, with Harlan's last pot of coffee gone cold on the stove, and Ruth's eyes red-rimmed with tiredness, and Vivian's right hand cramped from writing, the letter sounded exactly like a woman that Clarence Dutton would cross any distance to find. They put it face down on the table and agreed to read it again in the morning, with fresh eyes and daylight, before either of them decided it was ready. Vivian walked upstairs to her room at the east end of the hall and stood at the window for a while in the dark, looking at the prairie. The stars were extraordinary out here, in a way that Boston's built-up glow had never permitted. She had never been someone who thought about stars particularly, and she did not think about them now in any poetic sense. She was too tired and too keyed up for anything poetic. But she stood there looking at them anyway, because they were there and she was here, and both of those facts were strange, and neither one was going to resolve itself by worrying. Somewhere out there, Clarence Dutton was probably writing a letter to someone. She went to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking in the small hours to stare at the ceiling and rearrange the arithmetic of her situation. In the morning, she and Ruth read the letter again. They made 2 small changes. Then they gave it to Gideon and told him they were ready. Gideon read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen table in the morning light, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at the window for a moment without saying anything. "Well?" Ruth said. "It's good." He said it like a man admitting something he'd rather not. "It's very good. If I didn't know better—" He stopped. "If you didn't know better, you'd believe her," Ruth said. "Yes." Vivian was watching him from across the table. She had slept 6 hours and woken with the letter already running through her head, checking it for weaknesses the way you check arithmetic, looking for the place where the logic breaks, the detail that doesn't track, the sentence that sounds constructed rather than felt. She hadn't found one. She wasn't sure if that meant the letter was good or if it meant she was too close to it to see clearly. "The name," Gideon said. "You're using your real name." "I'm using my real first name," Vivian said. "The last name is different. Eleanor Marsh." She had chosen it carefully, common enough to be unremarkable, specific enough to anchor a person. If he investigates, which he will, there won't be much to find. That's consistent with the profile. She's a woman who came west recently, doesn't have deep roots here yet, hasn't established much of a paper trail. How did he find her? A notice in the Hayward's Ford paper. Personal correspondence sought, professional woman new to the territory. I had Terrence Wills post it when we confirmed Dutton was operating in that area. She paused. "Wills owed you something for the $1,200, I assumed." Gideon looked at her. There was something complicated in his expression. Not quite appreciation, not quite discomfort, somewhere between the two. "You assumed correctly. I also wrote to him 3 days ago," Vivian said. "Before you read the letter. I wanted to make sure the notice was placed before we lost the window." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Vivian was aware that she had moved on something without waiting for his agreement, and she was also aware that she was going to need to account for that directly rather than hoping he'd let it pass. "I should have told you first," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "You should have." "I was concerned about the timing." "I understand that." He picked up the letter again, looked at it without reading. "Don't do it again without telling me." "I won't." She meant it. She also knew, and she suspected he knew she knew, that if the timing had been the same, she would have made the same call. But agreeing to tell him was genuine, because making the decision without him was different from making it secretly, and she could honor the first while holding on to the second. Ruth was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone filing information away. "So now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," Vivian agreed. Waiting turned out to be its own kind of work. She had expected the days to feel suspended, stretched thin between the sending of the letter and whatever came back. Instead, they were dense with ordinary things. The ongoing accounts, which continued to generate questions and small problems in the way that all living operations do. Ruth had taken over the schooling of Willie and Pete's younger brother, a 9-year-old named James, who was technically Pete's responsibility, but had been absorbing education from whatever happened to be around him, which was not an optimal system. Ruth set up a proper hour of lessons each morning at the kitchen table, using books she'd brought in her satchel, and James turned out to be startlingly quick, the kind of child who absorbs information at a rate that makes adults slightly nervous. Vivian watched Ruth teach sometimes from the doorway of the study. There was something in it that she hadn't expected. Not just the competence, though Ruth was genuinely good at it, but the way Ruth seemed to become a slightly different person in front of the child, less defended. The anger that Vivian had felt radiating off her since her arrival, controlled, useful anger, but anger nonetheless, softened into something more patient and particular when she was explaining fractions to James. "You're good with him," Vivian said one afternoon when the lesson had ended and James had gone racing out to find Pete. "Children don't have a choice about needing help," Ruth said, stacking the books into her satchel. "That makes it easier." She paused. "Adults have a choice and mostly don't ask for it, and then resent you when you offer anyway. Children just need things and tell you so." Vivian thought about that for a while. The reply came 18 days after the notice had been placed in the Hayward's Ford paper. It arrived in the regular post from town, tucked between a supply invoice and a letter from a cattle broker in Kansas City, and Vivian didn't immediately recognize the handwriting on the outside because she had never seen Dutton's hand before. She had only seen the letters he'd written to her as Douglas Fairfield, and he apparently wrote differently under different names, which was either very deliberate or simply the natural result of performing a different character each time. She recognized it for what it was before she opened it, because of the return notation, E. Hartwell, Hayward's Ford, and because of the quality of the paper, which was better than anything else in the day's mail. He chose his stationery carefully. Of course he did. She took it to the study, closed the door, and sat down. Then she got up, opened the door, and called for Ruth. They read it together at the study table, which felt correct, though Vivian couldn't have explained exactly why. Some things should be witnessed. The letter was 4 pages, written in a hand that was controlled and elegant, with the particular evenness of someone who has practiced. The content was, she had expected it to be good, had braced herself for it, and it was still slightly worse than she'd braced for. Not worse in quality, worse in the sense of better than she wanted it to be, more effective than she'd hoped, which in this context amounted to the same thing. He had read the notice. He had been struck by it. He said this simply and without fanfare, which was better technique than fanfare would have been. He had hesitated before writing because he was not by nature a man who responded to notices, but something about the phrasing had stayed with him. He had asked around, carefully, he said, without wanting to intrude, and had heard of a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who was recently arrived in the territory and had a reputation for unusual competence. He admired competence. He found it rare. Then 4 paragraphs that asked questions, specific questions. What had brought her west? What she found difficult about it? What she missed about the life she'd left? What she was proud of having managed on her own? Ruth set down her side of the letter and looked at the table. "There it is." "There it is," Vivian said. "The inventory, the careful construction of an attachment, beginning with the questions that would make the woman feel seen." "He's faster than I expected," Ruth said. "With me, it took 3 weeks before the questions got this specific." "He's refining his approach." Vivian turned back to the first page, reading it again. "Or she's more attractive to him than his usual targets. Eleanor Marsh, as we wrote her. She fits his profile almost exactly. He's probably excited." She paused on that word, in the way a hunter gets excited when he finds good tracks. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you all right?" Vivian looked up. "Reading that," Ruth said, "knowing what it is and still reading it, it's—" She seemed to be looking for the right word and not quite finding it. "It got to me, even knowing. That's the thing that makes me angriest, actually, that even when you know it's a script, the script still works a little." Vivian thought about that honestly. She looked at the letter again. The questions were good questions. They were the questions she would have wanted someone to ask her, in another life, in different circumstances. And there was a version of her, the version that had lived in Boston and believed in Douglas Fairfield's handwriting, That would have felt those questions as warmth. Yes, she said. It still works a little. That's important to remember. It means we write back carefully, because if it works on me even knowing what it is, it will absolutely work on whatever woman he finds next if we don't stop him. She got up and found Gideon, who was in the barn with Harlan working on something structural that involved a lot of timber and mild swearing. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it with Harlan looking over his shoulder. She had stopped trying to have private conversations about this in front of Harlan, because Harlan was going to find out everything anyway, and pretending otherwise just wasted everyone's time. "He's in Hayward's Ford," Gideon said, "or was when he sent this. He gave a return address. That might be real, or it might be a point of convenience." He turned the pages. "He'll have someone collect his mail for him. He doesn't stay anywhere he can be reliably found." "I know, but he'll have to come back to check the return." She looked at him. "We need someone in Hayward's Ford who can watch the address without being obvious about it." "I know a man," Harlan said, before Gideon could speak. They both looked at him. "Friend of mine runs a feed store there. Been there 20 years. Nobody thinks twice about an old man at a feed store knowing everyone's business." He shrugged, which was as close to an explanation as Harlan generally got. "I'll write him." "Write him," Gideon said. The exchange of letters took 6 weeks. Vivian wrote 7. Dutton wrote 6. He skipped the fourth exchange, which he had expected based on Ruth's account of his pattern, tapering in the later months. She had accounted for this in her construction of Eleanor Marsh's response to the gap, which involved a note that was subtly but clearly hurt by the silence and had resolved to be less available as a result, which was exactly the kind of response that, according to Ruth, had caused Dutton to write back within 4 days. He wrote back in 3. Each of Vivian's letters she wrote and then rewrote, sometimes 4 times, sometimes more, reading them aloud to Ruth, who would listen with her eyes closed and then say, systematically, which part sounded like Vivian and which part sounded like Eleanor, and whether the distinction between those two things was still holding. It was meticulous and exhausting, and occasionally they disagreed sharply about specific word choices in ways that required Vivian to sit with the disagreement for an hour before she could assess it clearly enough to decide. "This sentence," Ruth said one evening, tapping a page, "I find I trust my own judgment less out here than I did at home." That's Vivian. Eleanor would say the same thing. Eleanor would say it differently. She'd say something like, "I'm learning that judgment made in one place doesn't always translate to another. It's more uncertain, less self-aware." Vivian looked at the sentence. She saw what Ruth meant. Eleanor Marsh, as they'd built her, was smart but not quite as calibrated as Vivian, not as clear-eyed about her own processes. That gap between capable and self-aware was where Dutton slid in. He made you feel that he was the missing piece of your self-awareness, that with him you'd finally have the external confirmation that made your internal compass reliable. "You're right," she said, and rewrote it. Gideon read each letter before it was sent and each reply when it arrived, and he never said much about either beyond occasional specific observations, a detail that could be confirmed or couldn't, a claim that matched something he knew about Dutton's pattern or didn't. What he did that she hadn't expected was sit in on the rewriting sessions sometimes, not contributing, just present. She had asked him once, early in the process, if there was something specific he wanted to check. "No," he said, He stopped and started over. Clara would have done this if she'd been the one who survived it. She'd have wanted to be the one to... He didn't finish the sentence. Vivian didn't push it. She understood what he meant. Harlan's friend in Hayward's Ford confirmed at the end of the 3rd week that a man matching Dutton's description was collecting mail from a box at the postal counter, coming in every 5 to 7 days, usually in the late morning. He had given the name Hartwell. He was charming and tipped well. He appeared to be staying at a boarding house at the north end of town. 2 women in town had mentioned him with the particular note in their voices that suggested he had turned his attention in their direction. "He's hunting while he's corresponding," Ruth said, when Vivian read this to them. "Of course he is. He runs multiple at once." She had suspected this. "We need to move faster." The 7th letter from Eleanor Marsh was different from the previous 6. The previous 6 had been carefully measured. Warm, but not eager. Interested, but not desperate. The portrait of a woman who was almost but not quite convinced. The 7th letter said, in the plainest terms Eleanor Marsh was capable of, "I believe I would like to meet you. It also mentioned, with the casual specificity that Vivian had learned was more persuasive than fanfare, that she had recently come into management of a small sum of money left to her by an uncle and had been uncertain how best to apply it in the territory, and had been hoping to discuss it with someone she trusted. Ruth, reading the draft, said, "That's not subtle. It's not meant to be subtle. It's meant to be what he's looking for." Vivian looked at her. By this stage of the correspondence, he's already made his assessment. He knows she's interested. He knows she has money. The only thing left is the meeting. She set down the draft. "We're giving him permission to come." He wrote back in 2 days. He would be honored, he wrote, to meet her. He happened to be traveling in her direction in the coming weeks. Ranch business, nothing that would interest her, but it meant he would be in the area of Caldwell Crossing before the month was out. He hoped she would do him the considerable honor of permitting him to call. She had put Caldwell Crossing in the 6th letter as Eleanor Marsh's current location, because it was close enough to the ranch to be manageable and far enough from Hayward's Ford that he would have to commit to the journey. He had committed. Gideon read the reply standing in the kitchen doorway, and his face when he looked up at her was something she did not have immediate words for. Not satisfaction, because it wasn't clean enough for that. More like the moment when something you have been building for a long time shows you, for the first time, that it might actually hold. "He's coming," Gideon said. "He's coming. 2 weeks, maybe 3. He'll take his time. He doesn't rush the approach." She thought about this. "We need a location. Somewhere public enough that he feels safe, controlled enough that we can manage what happens." "There's a hotel dining room in Caldwell Crossing," Gideon said. "Main building, street-facing windows, 1 entrance. I know the owner." "Can he be trusted?" "Within reason." "Within reason is enough." She sat down at the kitchen table. "I need to think through how this works." Ruth was already sitting with a piece of paper and a pen, which was Ruth's standard response to most situations. "Walk it through," she said, "from the beginning. He arrives in Caldwell Crossing. Then what?" Vivian walked it through. The meeting would be at the hotel dining room. Eleanor Marsh, one woman, alone, which was what he would expect and what would make him comfortable. Gideon would be in the building, not visible from the dining room, close enough to move quickly. Harlan would be outside. The hotel owner would know, in general terms, that a situation might require his assistance, without knowing enough specific details to complicate things, if Dutton happened to speak with him first. "He'll be charming," Vivian said. "He'll be very charming. He'll ask questions, the same kinds of questions he asked in the letters, but in person now, watching my face while I answer." She looked at the table. "I have to be Eleanor, not Vivian, for however long the meeting runs. If he sees Vivian, if he sees someone who is watching him as carefully as he's watching her, he'll know." "Can you do that?" Ruth asked. Vivian thought about the woman she'd been 7 months ago in Boston, reading a man's letters and believing every word. That woman wasn't gone. She was just angrier now, and anger, if you held it in the right place, could be used. "Yes," she said. "What's the end game, Dick?" Ruth said. "He comes, he has dinner, he's charming. Then what? We can't have him arrested for having dinner." "No." Vivian looked up. "We need him to say it, not imply it, not gesture at it. Say it. Make the offer specific enough that it constitutes something actionable." She paused. "Which means Eleanor has to get close enough to the edge of agreeing that he commits." "That's the most dangerous part," Gideon said. "I know." "If it goes wrong, I know, Gideon." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You don't have to be the one at the table. We can't," she said, simply, without heat. "He's corresponded with Eleanor for 6 weeks. He knows her handwriting, her phrasing, the way she builds a sentence. He'll have been building a picture of her in his head this whole time, and that picture has to match what sits down across from him at dinner." She looked at him steadily. "It has to be me." Another silence. "There's something else," Ruth said, and her voice had changed slightly, gone careful in a new way. She had a letter on the table that Vivian hadn't noticed her bring in, and she put her hand flat on it now. "This came in the Morning Post. It's addressed to me, not to Eleanor." Vivian went still. Ruth slid the letter across. The handwriting on the outside was nothing like Dutton's. Looser, older, with an inconsistency in the letter formation that suggested someone whose hands weren't entirely steady. The return gave only a town name, Millhaven, Colorado, and a single initial, Vivian opened it. The woman who had written it identified herself as Margaret Ellis. She was 53 years old. She had been, for 11 years, the administrative partner, and she wrote the word without further explanation, partner, in the operations of a man she called Clarence, and she had found Ruth's name through a chain of inquiry she explained only vaguely, but that seemed to involve a women's social organization in Kansas City whose members talked to each other across considerable distances. She wanted, she wrote, to speak with someone. She had ledgers. She had letters. She had documentation going back 9 years, organized by the name Clarence had used in each location, the names of women he had targeted, the amounts he had taken, and where the money had gone. She had carried this documentation for 3 years because she had not known what to do with it. She had not known until she read something, she didn't specify what, that made her think someone might finally be in a position to use it. She was prepared to bring it, if someone would tell her where to come. Vivian read the letter twice. Then she looked up at Ruth. "You knew," she said. Not accusatory, just reading the situation. "I suspected," Ruth said. "The women's organization in Kansas City. I wrote to them 8 weeks ago asking if anyone had encountered a man fitting Dutton's description. I didn't know if it would produce anything." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to build towards something that might not materialize." Gideon had come around the table. He read the letter over Vivian's shoulder, and she felt the quality of his stillness change as he read, something tightening and then slowly releasing. 9 years, he said. "Yes." "Clara was 4 years ago." He set the letter back on the table. "This woman was there when—" He stopped. "Possibly," Vivian said carefully. "We don't know what she knew or when." "No." He moved back from the table and stood at the window. "We don't." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard toward the barn, and James was running after him, and the ordinary morning of the ranch continued at its ordinary pace, entirely unaware that something had shifted at the kitchen table. "Right back to her," Vivian said to Ruth. "Tell her to come." "She might be working with him," Ruth said, "sending her to warn him." "She might be." Vivian looked at the letter again. The documentation she describes. Ledgers, correspondence, 9 years of records. That's not a warning. That's a liability. She turned the letter over in her hands. If she were trying to protect him, she would have come to us with a story. She came to us with records. That's a different kind of person. "It's a different kind of risk," Gideon said from the window. "Everything about this is a risk." Vivian looked at him. "We have 3 weeks before he arrives in Caldwell Crossing. If she can get here before that—" "Tell her to come fast," Ruth said. Vivian wrote back that afternoon. The letter was short, 6 sentences, and gave the ranch's location and the instruction to come as quickly as the journey permitted. She did not explain why the timing mattered, because if Margaret Ellis was what her letter suggested she was, she would understand without explanation. And if she wasn't, then the urgency would read as ordinary. She posted it with the supply run, and then went back to the study and sat down at the ledger she'd been working through before the morning's mail had rearranged everything. She worked for an hour without being able to fully concentrate, which was unusual for her. Numbers were generally reliable companions precisely because they didn't ask anything of her emotionally. They were what they were. But today they kept sliding away, replaced by the image she was building in her head of the dining room in Caldwell Crossing. A table, 2 chairs, a man across from her with gray eyes, and a crescent scar on the back of his right hand, asking questions he had asked 6 times before, to 6 different women, with the confident patience of someone who had never once expected to be on the receiving end of the same technique. Ruth knocked on the study door in the late afternoon and put a cup of coffee on the corner of the table. "You're not reading the ledger," she said. "You're looking at it." "I know." Ruth sat down in the chair across the table that had become, over the preceding weeks, her default location when she wanted to talk. "Are you scared?" "Yes." Vivian said it without hesitation, because there was no point doing otherwise. "I'm also—" She looked for the right word. "Certain, both at the same time, which is uncomfortable but probably correct." Ruth wrapped her hands around her own cup. "He's going to look at you across that table," she said, "and try to make you feel like Eleanor. And some part of you is going to have to let him." She paused. "That's the part that worries me." "It worries me too," Vivian said honestly. "But the part that worries me more is the alternative. which is that he gets up from that table and walks back out into the world and finds the next woman and the next one after that. She looked at Ruth. How many do you think there have been? Total, over 9 years. Ruth was quiet. More than we know about, Vivian said. Many more. Women who came west and waited and ran out of money and found something, some job, some way to survive, and never told anyone because the telling was too humiliating or too complicated, or because they'd already written letters home saying they were getting married and they couldn't face undoing that. She looked at the ledger in front of her, not seeing it. I almost didn't report it to Orville Potts. I almost just got on the eastbound stage and gone home and not said a word, because that felt survivable in a way that talking about it didn't. What changed your mind? Vivian thought about it. Orville told me someone had come asking, she said, that there was a man looking for the person who did this. And I thought, she paused. I thought, if Clara Shaw had met one person who was already looking, who already knew, who already believed her, maybe she would have asked for help sooner. Ruth said nothing for a moment. Then she looked down at her coffee. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I want you to know that. I know. I mean after. Whatever comes after the meeting. I'm not going back to Bitter Creek. Vivian looked at her. I don't know exactly what I mean by that, Ruth said, with the slightly irritated precision of someone who prefers to know exactly what they mean and doesn't currently. I want to say it. All right, Vivian said, I'm glad. They sat for a while in the late afternoon quiet, both of them holding things they weren't entirely ready to put into words, which was fine, because there was still work to do and time was moving, and 3 weeks was not a long time to prepare for the most dangerous conversation Vivian Ashcroft had ever agreed to sit down for. Margaret Ellis arrived 8 days later on the afternoon stage from Wichita, carrying a carpet bag and a locked document case, and she was nothing like what Vivian had pictured. She was small and gray-haired and walked with a slight limp from an old injury that she did not mention or explain. Her face was the kind of face that had once been pretty and had become, through time and something harder than time, something more interesting than pretty. She looked at Vivian on the depot platform and then looked at Gideon, who had come with the wagon, and then she looked at the document case in her own hands and said, I should have done this 3 years ago. You're here now, Vivian said. Yes. Margaret looked at the prairie. I am. On the ride back to the ranch, she said almost nothing, and Vivian did not push her, because arriving somewhere with a locked case full of evidence against a man you'd worked alongside for 11 years was the kind of thing that probably required some quiet on either side of it. What Margaret Ellis had brought with her would only become fully clear the next morning when she unlocked the document case on the kitchen table and began, methodically and without apparent emotion, to lay out 9 years of Clarence Dutton's life. The document case contained 4 ledgers, a bundle of letters organized by location and date, a handwritten registry that Margaret had apparently maintained herself, and a separate envelope that she set to the side before opening anything else and did not explain. She unlocked it all at the kitchen table the next morning with Vivian and Ruth on one side, Gideon at the end, and Harlan, who had by this point entirely abandoned any pretense of not being involved, standing near the stove with a coffee cup and the expression of a man attending something he considers a serious proceeding. Margaret opened the first ledger. I started keeping records in 1874, she said. I didn't know at first what I was keeping them for. I told myself it was administrative, that someone needed to track the finances. She smoothed the page with one hand, an old habit. By 1876, I knew what it was. I kept records because if I ever stopped being useful to him, I wanted something that proved I knew too much to be abandoned the same way he abandoned everyone else. Ruth said quietly, That's honest. I'm too old to be anything else. Margaret turned the ledger so they could see it. The entries were meticulous, dates, locations, names, amounts. These are the women, the ones I know about. There may be others from before I met him in 73. She moved her finger down the column. 23 names, over 9 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian looked at the column of names. 23 women, each one reduced in this ledger to a line item, a location, a sum of money, an outcome notation that Margaret had recorded in a small, precise hand. Most of the outcome notations said returned or relocated. 3 said unknown. 1 4 years back, in a notation next to the name of a woman from Indiana, said deceased. Clara Shaw, Gideon said. His voice was level in the way that cost something. Margaret looked at him. She had been told, the previous evening, who he was. She had not said anything when she was told, only looked at him in a way that was neither pity nor apology, but something more complicated. Now she found the entry without looking for it, which meant she already knew exactly where it was. She turned the ledger and pointed. Gideon looked at the entry for a long moment. He didn't touch the ledger. His hands were flat on the table. "She's marked unknown," he said. "I found out later," Margaret said. "What happened to her? I wrote it in the margin. I don't know if that—" She stopped. "I don't suppose it matters to you what I wrote in the margin." "No," Gideon said. "Not particularly." Another silence. "The separate envelope," Vivian said. "What's in that?" Margaret pulled it toward her. She didn't open it immediately. "Before I show you this, I want to explain something." She looked at Vivian directly. "I was not a good person for a long time. I knew what he was doing, and I benefited from it, and I told myself stories about why it was acceptable, and I believed some of them for longer than I should have." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to misunderstand what this is. This is not redemption. I'm too practical for that kind of thinking. This is—" I got old, and he started looking at me the way he looks at things that are past their usefulness, and I realized that waiting for a better moment was the same as not doing it at all. Vivian looked at her steadily. "I understand. I'm not sure you do entirely, but I appreciate you saying so." Margaret opened the envelope. Inside were 4 folded documents. These are financial instruments, transfer records. The money he took from the women, not all of it, a significant portion, was moved through 3 separate accounts, 2 of which he opened under names I've documented. The 3rd account he opened under my name. She put the documents on the table. I did not know about the 3rd account until 1879. By then there was enough money in it that going to any authority would have made me look like a willing participant rather than a victim. She looked at Gideon. "Which I partly was." Gideon looked at the documents. "How much?" "In that account, at last accounting, $9,400. No one spoke for a moment. "The money from Clara," Gideon said. "Is it in there?" "I don't know specifically. The funds were commingled. I can't tell you which dollars came from which woman." Margaret met his eyes. "I'm sorry. I know that's not an answer." "It's an honest one." He pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, and no one said anything while he did. After about a minute, he turned around. "What do you need from us?" "I need to know what you're planning," Margaret said, "because whatever is in that envelope has to be used in conjunction with something that can actually put him in front of a court. On its own, it's a story I'm telling about a man who will tell a different story and has more charm than I do. But with a direct complaint, a victim who will testify, documentation of an ongoing scheme." She looked at Vivian. "You have something. That's why I came." "We have a meeting," Vivian said. "In 5 days. He's coming to Caldwell Crossing." Margaret went very still. "He thinks he's meeting Eleanor Marsh," Vivian said. "A woman with money and no one to advise her." "He'll be cautious," Margaret said. "At an initial meeting, he never commits to anything directly. He reads the situation first. He'll be charming and interested, and he'll say almost nothing specific enough to be repeated in court." "I know, which is why the meeting isn't enough on its own." Vivian looked at the ledger, at the column of names. "But the meeting, plus your documentation, plus testimony from women who are willing to give it—" "How many women do you have?" Margaret asked. "2 at this table." Vivian looked at Ruth. "And I suspect you know how to reach others." Margaret looked at the envelope, at the 4 financial documents. "I know where some of them are," she said slowly. "Women who came west and stayed. Some of them found their footing eventually. Some of them—" She stopped. "Some of them would rather never speak of it again." "That's their right," Vivian said. "But the ones who want to, the ones who've been carrying it for years and haven't had anyone to give it to." She looked at the ledger again. "Those women deserve to know this is happening." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her carpet bag and produced a small notebook worn at the corners, the kind of book a person keeps close for a long time. "I have addresses for 11 of them," she said. "Current addresses, as of last year. Some may have moved." She set the notebook on the table. "I wrote to some of them, years ago, anonymously. I never heard back. I don't know if the letters reached them, or if they reached them and were burned." Write to them now, Vivian said. Not anonymously, with your name and this address. Tell them what you've told us. Tell them what's coming. She paused. We have 5 days before the meeting. After the meeting, whatever happens, there will be a legal process, and that process will need time. Whatever letters you can get out today or tomorrow. Some of them won't come, Ruth said. She wasn't being pessimistic. She was being practical, which was the same thing Ruth usually was. Even if they want to, even if they're furious and they've been carrying it for years. Some of them will have lives now that they've built carefully, and they won't want to put those lives in front of a court and have lawyers pick through them. I know, Vivian said. That's their right, too. She looked at Ruth. But some of them will come. I came west on a stage with $43 and a plan someone else had made for me, and I stayed and I'm sitting here. People surprise you. Ruth was quiet, and then she nodded once and picked up her pen. They spent the rest of that morning writing letters. Margaret to the 11 women in her notebook. Vivian drafting language that Margaret could adapt. Ruth helping with the phrasing in the trickier cases where the woman's situation suggested she might need a different approach. Harlan drove to town twice to post them. He did not complain about this, which meant he considered it important. Gideon spent the morning in the barn. Vivian didn't seek him out because she understood that he was working through something that didn't have a clean entry in anyone's ledger and needed the space to do it. He came in for the midday meal and ate without saying much, and then came and found her in the study afterward. The meeting, he said. He sat down in the chair across from her. Walk me through the specifics again. She walked him through them. The hotel dining room in Caldwell Crossing. A table near the window, which she would request when she arrived, so that the street-facing glass gave Gideon a clear sightline from outside without him needing to be in the building. The hotel owner, a man named Pryor, who owed Gideon 2 years of quietly managed range disputes, would be told that a woman in his dining room might need assistance, and he should be prepared to send for the town marshal if asked. The marshal, Gideon said. Do you trust him? Do you? Enough. He's not exceptional, but he's not corrupt, which is rarer than it should be. He turned his hat in his hands. She noticed he did this when he was working through something and hadn't arrived at a conclusion yet. I don't like that you're going to be sitting across from him alone. I know. I need you to understand that if anything, if the situation changes in a way that feels wrong, I'll excuse myself to the ladies' room and I won't come back, she said. We discussed this. I know we discussed it. I want to hear you say it again. She looked at him. There was something in his face that she'd been watching develop over the preceding weeks. Not slowly, exactly, but in the way that gradual things accumulate and then become suddenly visible. He was worried about her, not about the plan, about her specifically, as distinct from the plan, in a way that the plan didn't entirely account for. I'll walk out, she said. The moment it feels wrong, I'll walk out. Good. He set the hat down. Margaret, you trust her. I trust that her interests align with ours for the moment. Vivian picked up her pen, set it back down, which is the most reliable kind of trust in a situation like this. She spent 11 years with him. She did. She met his eyes. She also had his financial records in a locked case for 3 years and didn't use them to protect him. She used them to protect herself, which is a different calculation. She paused. People do terrible things out of fear and then stop when the fear shifts. That's not goodness, but it's real. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You're more generous with her than I am. I'm not generous with her. I'm practical about her. She looked at her hands on the table. The ink stain on her right index finger had become, over weeks, a permanent feature. She knows him in ways none of us do. She's watched him operate for 11 years. If she sits in that courtroom and says what she knows, no defense lawyer in Nebraska will be able to undo it. If she shows up, she'll show up. Vivian said it with more certainty than she felt, which she recognized as a choice rather than a conclusion. Some things you decided to believe because the alternative made the next step impossible. She came this far. She'll show up. He nodded, slowly, like a man accepting terms he hasn't entirely negotiated. Then he looked at the study window and said, The night before. Whatever happens the day of the meeting, the night before, I want everyone here. Dinner. All of us. She looked at him. I know that sounds... I don't know why I want that. He picked up the hat again. I just do. All right, she said. Dinner. All of us. The days before the meeting had the compressed, unreliable quality of time when something large is approaching. Vivian found herself accomplishing tasks without fully remembering the doing of them. Accounts reconciled, correspondence answered, supply invoices checked and filed, as though her hands had agreed to keep working while her mind worked on something else entirely. She slept adequately. She ate what was put in front of her. She had 3 separate conversations with Ruth about the meeting that she could only partially recall afterward because she had been, during those conversations, also preparing herself in some interior way that didn't have a clear name. Margaret stayed on in the small room off the kitchen, moving into the household's routines, with the quiet, practical efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime making themselves useful in other people's spaces. She helped Harlan with the supply organization without being asked. She sat in on James's lessons twice and contributed, without announcing her intention to contribute, a knowledge of geography that turned out to be genuinely impressive, given that she had spent 11 years traveling the territory with Dutton and had apparently retained a detailed mental map of all of it. On the second evening, she sat with Vivian in the study after supper, and they talked, not about the meeting or the documents or the letters they'd sent out, but about other things. Margaret asked about the accounting work, which was an unexpected question from a woman who had been characterizing her own relationship to bookkeeping as largely administrative. And what emerged over an hour of conversation was that Margaret was considerably more financially literate than she had presented. She'd managed the actual movement of money through Dutton's operation for a decade. She knew how to structure accounts, how to obscure a paper trail, and consequently, exactly how to follow one. You could have done this independently, Vivian said. Not as an accusation. Probably. Margaret looked at the lamp. But doing something alone, in the dark, with no one who knows what you're doing and why, it's easier to convince yourself you're wrong, that you're overreacting, that you misunderstood. She paused. I needed someone else to know first, to confirm that what I was seeing was what I thought it was. Vivian said nothing for a moment. Then, I understand that better than I'd like. Most people do. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Women especially. We're taught from childhood that our interpretations of events are less reliable than the events themselves. That if something feels wrong, probably we're reading it wrong. She looked at Vivian directly. He's very good at using that against us. He never has to tell us we're wrong. He just asks the question gently enough that we ask it ourselves. Vivian thought about the letters, about reading them 6 times each to admire the penmanship. Yes, she said. The dinner Gideon had wanted was on the evening before the meeting, and it was at the long table in the main room, all of them, the entire household. Pete and Tom Greer and Boots and Willie, who had turned 16 the previous week and had received, from Harlan, a penknife and exactly 2 words of congratulation. James, who had stopped being primarily Pete's responsibility and had somehow become everyone's, eating his supper with the focused absorption of a child who has learned that if you eat quickly, you can listen longer. Ruth, Margaret, Harlan at his end of the table, which was his end in the way that some things belong to people without any formal arrangement. Gideon sat at the other end and said grace over the meal in the non-religious way that frontier people sometimes managed, not calling on anything outside themselves, just a moment of acknowledgement that things could be worse, and tonight were not. The supper was good. Harlan had apparently decided it was an occasion and cooked accordingly, which meant there was more food than the table needed, and everyone ate past the point of necessity, and no one apologized for it. There were conversations Vivian couldn't fully track, running across and over each other, something about a fence line Tom had repaired that was already showing signs of needed further repair, something Willie said about the grain arrangement that made Pete laugh, something James asked about Colorado that Margaret answered with the specificity of someone who'd been there recently and under complicated circumstances and had kept the geography anyway. Gideon, at his end of the table, was mostly quiet. He ate. He listened. He refilled cups when they needed refilling. He looked several times at Vivian, and she looked back, and they said nothing across the length of the table, but the not saying had its own content. After supper, when the others had moved off to the evening's various endings, Vivian found him on the porch. The Nebraska night was clear and cold, and the stars were what they always were out here. Implausible in number, no sense of scale. "You're ready," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," she said. "The waiting is the hard part." "For me too." She stood beside him at the porch rail. The ranch was quiet. The barn, the corrals, the twisted shape of the old cottonwood at the south corner that reminded her, every time she noticed it, of the depot at Caldwell Crossing, and the bench with the broken leg, and Orville Potts's pale blue eyes. "I thought about going back to Boston," she said, "early on, the second week." He looked at her, not seriously, more like I held the option in my head and turned it over. She looked at the dark prairie. "I had a life there, an organized life. I knew what every day would look like." "Would you have been happy?" "Probably not." She paused. "I wasn't unhappy. There's a version of not unhappy that people mistake for a life." She looked at the stars. "I would have been fine. Instead of this." "Instead of this." She turned to look at him. "I'm not sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not sorry either, that you stayed." He said it plainly, without particular softness or emphasis, which was the way he said most things that mattered. And she had come to understand that the plainness was not a lack of feeling but the opposite. The feeling so steady it didn't need ornament. She did not say anything in response. She stood beside him a while longer, and the night was cold and very clear, and in the morning she was going to sit across a table from a man who had stolen something from her that couldn't be fully returned, and she was going to be ready. He arrived in Caldwell Crossing on a Thursday. Harlan's contact at the feed store sent a boy with a note. Man-matching description, arrived yesterday afternoon on the northbound stage, staying at the Caldwell House Hotel, given the name Hartwell to the clerk. Had supper in the dining room alone and asked the server casually whether a woman named Eleanor Marsh had been in recently, so he was already preparing. Vivian read the note at the kitchen table, alone, because she had been awake since before dawn and hadn't wanted to wake anyone else. She read it twice, folded it, set it in the center of the table, and sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. He was real. She had known this, had known it in an abstract managed way, but the note made it concrete. He had eaten supper in the dining room where she would sit tomorrow. He had said Eleanor Marsh's name to a server with the easy familiarity of someone who had been thinking about a person for weeks. He thought he was coming to collect something. She thought about Clara Shaw, 22 years old, adding columns in her head faster than most men could do on paper. She thought about Ruth Calloway arriving at Bitter Creek with $41 and a fury she'd had nowhere to put. She thought about Margaret Ellis carrying a locked document case across the territory for 3 years, waiting for a moment that felt real enough to use. She thought about her $312 and the blank stretch of the Nebraska morning and a stage driver who couldn't meet her eyes. The note sat in the center of the table. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the ranch was beginning its morning. She could hear the barn, the distant sound of movement, the particular rhythm of a place that had learned to trust itself. She picked up her pen and wrote one final letter. Not to Dutton, not to anyone she'd been corresponding with. A letter to the county prosecutor in Wichita, to whom Gideon had already written twice, and who had written back both times with the careful interest of a man who needed more before he could move. She told him, concisely, what they had. Margaret's ledgers, the financial documents, the testimony of 2 women who had been directly defrauded and were prepared to appear in court, and the documentation of an ongoing scheme that they were prepared to demonstrate in real time. She told him the name the man was currently using and the name of the hotel where he was currently staying. She told him to be in Caldwell Crossing by Friday morning. She sealed the letter and left it on the table for Harlan to take to the express post when he rode out. Then she went upstairs and changed her dress, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and practiced, very quietly, the expression of a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who had been waiting months for someone to come. It was not her best expression. She practiced it again. By the time Ruth knocked softly on her door an hour later and came in and sat on the edge of the bed and said simply, "Today," Vivian had it right. Not perfect. Eleanor Marsh wouldn't be perfect, but real enough that a man who had spent 11 years reading women for vulnerability would recognize it and lean forward and begin, with the particular confidence of someone who has never lost, to do what he always did, which was exactly what they needed him to do. Gideon had the wagon ready at mid-morning. The 12 miles to Caldwell Crossing passed without much conversation, which was the right kind of silence. Not strained, just focused, each of them carrying their piece of what was about to happen. Margaret sat in the wagon bed with her document case on her knees. Ruth sat beside her. Harlan had stayed at the ranch because Harlan had decided that James should not be left alone with 4 ranch hands and no responsible adult. A decision that everyone recognized as practical, and that also allowed Harlan the dignity of not having to explain why he didn't want to be there when it happened. The town appeared the way it always appeared, dusty and ordinary and indifferent, the way frontier towns are indifferent to whatever any particular person needs from them. The hotel was on the main street, 2-story, with a dining room that faced the road through wide windows. Pryor was waiting inside the lobby when they arrived, a compact man with a careful face who shook Gideon's hand and looked at Vivian with the particular solemnity of someone who has been told enough to be nervous. "He had breakfast here this morning," Pryor said low. "Asked again about Miss Marsh. I told him she'd been in a few days ago and expected to return today." "Good," Vivian said. "Is he in the building?" "Not right now. Saw him go out about an hour ago, north end of town. He'll come back." She looked at the dining room through the lobby doorway. "I'll take the table by the window." Ruth touched her arm briefly on the way to the table, so not a reassuring grip, just contact, the kind that says I'm here without making a speech of it. Margaret went to a table in the far corner with her document case where she would wait. Gideon went outside. Vivian sat down at the window table, ordered coffee she didn't intend to drink, and waited. She did not have to wait long. He came through the dining room door 40 minutes later and she recognized him immediately. Not from any description she'd been given, but in the way you recognize a thing you've been preparing for. Brown hair, gray eyes, 5'11", and moving with the loose confidence Ruth had described. The crescent scar on the back of his right hand, visible as he pushed open the door. He was handsome in the particular way of men who have learned to use it. Not overwhelming, nothing that would put a careful woman on guard, just present enough to be reassuring. He saw her by the window. He smiled. And she smiled back with Eleanor Marsh's expression and watched him cross the room toward her and thought very clearly and without drama, "Here we go." "Miss Marsh," he said, with the warmth of someone greeting a person they've been looking forward to meeting. He held out his hand. "I'm Elliot Hartwell. It's a genuine pleasure." She shook his hand. His grip was practiced, firm but not assertive, the grip of a man who has learned exactly how much pressure reassures a woman without alarming her. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "please, sit down." He sat. The server came. He ordered coffee, asked Vivian if she wanted anything, and when she declined, thanked the server by name because he had already learned the server's name, because of course he had. "I have to confess," he said, settling back in the chair with the ease of someone entirely at home, "that I was not sure you'd be here. I hope you'll forgive me for saying that. I don't mean it as a criticism, only that I've found, in my experience, that correspondence sometimes promises a meeting that the reality of distance makes difficult." "I almost wasn't here," Vivian said, which was Eleanor's version of honest. "I'm glad you came." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were doing exactly what Ruth had said they would. The careful attending, the making of a person feel that they are the most interesting thing in the room. "Your letters were, I thought about them quite a bit actually, between each one." Mine or Eleanor's, she thought, and then pushed the thought down and stayed in the character. "I found myself looking forward to them," she said, which was true enough. She had looked forward to his replies the way a hunter looks forward to tracks. "You ask good questions. You give good answers." He smiled again. "That's rarer than you might think." She let the compliment land. Let it appear to land the way it was intended. She watched his face and she watched his hands, and she said Eleanor's lines with Eleanor's slightly uncertain warmth, and he leaned forward a fraction of an inch, and she noted the lean. 20 minutes in, he had told her about himself. The land investments, the travel, the sister he was devoted to. She noted the sister and said nothing about it. 30 minutes in, he asked about her financial situation in the way he always did, gently, sideways, framed as concern rather than inquiry. She told him about the uncle's money. She expressed uncertainty about what to do with it. She let herself sound slightly overwhelmed, slightly grateful that someone knowledgeable was willing to advise her. He became, almost imperceptibly, more focused. "There are opportunities in this territory," he said, for a woman with capital and the sense to recognize a good situation. The problem is knowing who to trust. He looked at her steadily. I know it's forward of me to say this after only one meeting, but I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's intended, that you're someone who would benefit from a partner, in the business sense. A partner, she said. Someone with territory knowledge, connections, someone who has done the groundwork that takes years to accumulate. He leaned forward another fraction. I've been considering a land venture north of here that has exceptional prospects. I've been holding it because I lacked a partner with the capital to move quickly. He paused. I mention it only because I think you're someone who would see the value immediately. There it was. She looked at him. She let Eleanor's face show a careful, cautious hope. The face of a woman who has been waiting for someone to offer her exactly this and is trying not to seem as eager as she feels. How much capital would something like that require? She asked. He named a figure. It was almost exactly what she had described, in the 6th letter, as the amount her uncle had left her. Of course it was. She opened her mouth to say something that Eleanor would say, something hesitant and interested, and then the door to the dining room opened, and Margaret Ellis walked across the floor and stopped at their table and set the document case on the empty chair beside them, and looked at Clarence Dutton with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just put it down. Dutton's face changed. It changed in a way that Vivian had not entirely anticipated. Not alarm, not guilt, not the face of a man caught in the act. Something more complicated than those things. Something that looked for just a second like the actual face of a person underneath the performance, and the actual face was tired. Margaret, he said. Clarence, she said. Then the door opened again, and Gideon walked in. And behind Gideon, having made the express post in sufficient time, the county prosecutor from Wichita, accompanied by the Caldwell Crossing town marshal, who was not exceptional but was, as Gideon had said, not corrupt. Dutton looked at the document case. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Vivian. She watched him understand. Miss Marsh, he said slowly, is not your name. No, Vivian said. It's not. He said nothing for a moment. The dining room was entirely silent. Pryor had cleared the other tables with a quiet efficiency that Vivian appreciated. The server stood near the kitchen door. You wrote the letters, Dutton said. We wrote the letters, she said, both of us. She saw him look at the document case again. She saw him calculate. She had expected, in this moment, some remnant of the charm, some attempt to reframe, to smile his way toward a different interpretation of events. Instead, he was very still, and the stillness was the most honest thing she had seen from him yet. Eleanor Marsh, he said, almost to himself, you invented a woman I would come for. Yes, Vivian said, we did. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not resentment, something older and more complicated than either of those things. The particular look of two people who know too much about each other's worst periods. You kept the records, he said. Everyone? Margaret said. The prosecutor had reached the table. He was a compact, serious man with the face of someone who has spent years listening to people explain themselves. He looked at Dutton with the practical interest of someone viewing a task that needs completing. Mr. Dutton, he said, I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. Dutton sat back in the chair. He looked at the table. He looked at the window through which the ordinary street of Caldwell Crossing continued its ordinary day, entirely unaware of the particular ending happening inside. Then he looked at Vivian one final time, not with charm, not with calculation, but with something that she couldn't name and wasn't sure she wanted to. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a person who has run a long race and arrived at the finish only to discover it was someone else's finish line all along. Well, he said, it was the same word Vivian had said on a bench with a broken leg 4 months ago when a stage driver had told her the truth. She supposed that was fair. They held Dutton in the Caldwell Crossing jailhouse overnight while the prosecutor reviewed Margaret's documents at the hotel, working through the night at the dining room table where, less than 12 hours earlier, Clarence Dutton had leaned forward and named a figure that matched a dead woman's inheritance almost to the dollar. Vivian knew this because she was still in town. They all were. Pryor had given them rooms, which he'd offered before anyone asked, and she'd accepted without the complicated negotiation she might have managed 4 months ago. She was tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired that comes from spending weeks in a state of heightened readiness and then having the thing you were ready for actually happen. Her body didn't know quite what to do with the absence of it. She sat in the small hotel room with her boots off and her back against the headboard and looked at the ceiling for a while. She could hear through the floor the low murmur of the prosecutor working. Occasional footsteps, the sound of papers turning, once a brief exchange with the marshal that she couldn't make out. The town outside was quiet the way small towns are quiet late at night. Not silent, just reduced to its essential sounds. A horse somewhere. Wind finding the gaps in the buildings. She had expected to feel something large when it was over, something proportionate to what it had cost. What she actually felt was a particular emptiness that wasn't unpleasant, the feeling of a space that had been occupied by a single difficult thing for a very long time and had just been vacated. She didn't know yet what would fill it. That seemed like a question for another day. Ruth knocked on her door at some point past midnight and came in without waiting for an answer, which was Ruth's way, and sat in the chair by the window with a cup of something that smelled like the hotel's very bad coffee. "Are you all right?" Ruth said. "I think so." Vivian looked at her. "Are you?" "I keep going over the moment he recognized Margaret," Ruth said, the way his face changed. She looked into the cup. "I thought I wanted to see him afraid. I thought that was what I needed." She paused. "He wasn't afraid. He was just done. Like a man who's been running for a long time and finally sat down. Does that bother you?" Ruth thought about it honestly, which was the only way Ruth thought about things. "A little. I wanted it to be bigger." She looked up. "Is that wrong?" "No," Vivian said. "I think we built it large for so long in our heads that the actual moment couldn't hold the weight." She shifted against the headboard. "He's a person, a terrible person who made terrible choices and caused terrible damage, but a person. People don't usually collapse into something satisfying when they're caught. They just stop." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Margaret's still up," she said. "I saw her light under the door." "I know. I don't know what to do with Margaret." "Neither do I." Vivian pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. "She did something very wrong for a very long time. She also did something very right when it mattered. I don't think those two things cancel each other out in either direction. I think they just both exist." "That's an uncomfortable thought." "Most honest thoughts are." Ruth drank the bad coffee with the expression of someone accepting a minor penance. "The prosecutor said he'd have questions for us in the morning." "I know." "Gideon said he'd be here at 7. Vivian nodded. She was aware from the way Ruth said Gideon's name that Ruth had opinions she was not currently stating, which was unusual for Ruth and therefore noticeable. "Just say it," Vivian said. Ruth looked at her. "He sat on the steps of the jailhouse for 2 hours after they took Dutton inside," she said. "Just sat there. Harlan's friend from the feed store eventually brought him a cup of something, and he drank it and sat there some more." She paused. "He wasn't celebrating." "No," Vivian said. "He wouldn't be. Because it doesn't fix Clara." "Nothing fixes Clara." She said it plainly, the way it needed to be said. "It stops the next Clara. That's what it fixes." Ruth set down the cup. She stood up, stretched, looked out the window at the dark street. "I'm going to stay," she said. "Here, in the territory. I want you to know that's decided." "You said that before." "I know. I'm saying it again because before it was a feeling and now it's a decision." She turned from the window. "The school outside Bitter Creek offered me a permanent position. I've been considering it for 2 months." She looked at Vivian directly. "But I think there might be something more useful here. Something that needs building. Something I'd rather build than teach fractions to 12 children who may or may not stay in Nebraska long enough to use them." Vivian looked at her. She understood what Ruth was gesturing at, had been turning the idea over in her own mind for weeks, in the spaces between the letters and the waiting and the work of the plan. A shapeless thing that had not yet become a plan. "Get some sleep," Vivian said. "We'll talk in the morning." Ruth left. Vivian turned out the lamp and lay in the dark and thought, not about Dutton or the prosecutor or the morning's questions, but about the ranch, the east-facing window in her room, the ledgers she'd reconciled and the ones still to come, Harlan's biscuits on the corner of the table, James learning fractions from Ruth's patient instruction, the long dinner table, the way the prairie looked when the light got complicated with the grass. She fell asleep faster than she expected, which was its own kind of answer. The prosecutor's name was Aldous Crane, and he was one of those men who used economy of speech as both a professional tool and a personal preference. He asked questions the way he apparently did everything, directly, without preamble, following each answer with the next question before the previous one had fully settled. He spoke with Vivian first for 2 hours in the hotel dining room with the morning light coming through the windows that had been the backdrop for the trap the previous day. The chairs were the same. She sat in the same seat. It was a different conversation. She told him everything, in order, beginning with Caldwell Crossing and ending with the dining room. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for most things, methodically, with attention to sequence and detail, anticipating the places where the account would need clarification. Crane listened without interrupting except for the occasional precise question when he needed a specific fact confirmed. "The letters you wrote as Eleanor Marsh," he said, "you still have copies. Everyone?" And his replies, "I'll need those." "I expected you would. I have them here." She produced the folder she'd brought from the ranch, which contained every draft, every revision note, and every letter in both directions, organized chronologically with marginal annotations explaining the strategic reasoning behind specific phrasings. Crane looked at the annotations and then looked at her. "You documented the methodology," he said. "I thought it might be useful." He looked at the folder for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "It will be," he said. He spoke with Ruth next, and then with Margaret for a very long time, nearly 3 hours, which Vivian could track by the position of the sun through the window of the lobby where she waited. When Margaret came out, she looked smaller than she had going in, not diminished exactly, but as though something that had been holding her at a particular height for years had released. She sat down beside Vivian on the lobby bench. "He'll use the ledgers," Margaret said. "All of them. He said the financial documentation alone would be sufficient for conviction on multiple counts, but combined with the testimonies and the letter correspondence..." She stopped. "He said he hasn't seen a fraud case assembled this completely in 20 years of practice." "What about your account?" Vivian said. "The one he opened under your name." "Crane says that's a separate matter and my cooperation counts significantly toward how it's handled." She looked at her hands. "I may still face charges. I was honest about that." She paused. "I'd rather face honest charges than dishonest protection. I've had enough of the second kind." Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What will you do after?" "I don't know yet." Margaret looked at the lobby wall, which was papered in a faded floral print that had once been cheerful and was now simply present. "I'm 53 years old and I've spent 11 years keeping records for a man who is using me as a shield. I don't have a great deal to build from." She paused. "But I have the records. I know where other women are. I know how the money moved." She looked at Vivian with the direct, practical gaze that Vivian had come to associate with her specifically, not warmth exactly, but something that operated in the same vicinity. "I suspect knowing things that no one else knows still has some value, even at 53. "It does," Vivian said. Gideon arrived at 7 as Ruth had said he would, and then stayed in the background through the morning's proceedings with the patience of someone who understands that some important work looks like waiting. Vivian found him outside after her session with Crane, standing near the wagon with his back to the hotel, looking at the ordinary street of Caldwell Crossing doing its ordinary morning things. She stood beside him. "He'll be convicted," she said. "Crane thinks the case is airtight. Multiple counts, multiple victims, 9 years of documentation." "Good." He didn't turn from the street. "How do you feel?" He was quiet for a long moment. She had learned, over months, that this quiet was not evasion. It was the actual process of him finding out how he felt, which he apparently did more slowly and more honestly than most people. "Like I thought I'd feel different," he said finally. "Like I thought the weight would lift. And it hasn't. Not yet." He turned to look at her. "Does that mean it didn't work?" "No," she said. "It means grief isn't a legal matter and courts can't resolve it." She looked at the street alongside him. "Clara is still gone. That doesn't change. What changes is that the thing that happened to her will be the last thing like it he does." She paused. "I think that matters even when it doesn't feel like enough." He nodded slowly. "It matters," he said. "I just need some time to get there." That's allowed. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that had been there for a while. She had been tracking it for weeks without addressing it directly, the way you track something peripheral because you're not sure you're reading it right, and you're not ready to be wrong. Now, standing in the ordinary morning of a street where something important had just ended and something else was somewhere in front of them without a name yet, she decided to read it directly. "I'm staying," she said, "at the ranch, permanently, if that's agreeable to you." He held her eyes. "It's agreeable to me. Not just as a bookkeeper." "No," he said. "Not just as a bookkeeper." She looked at him for a moment longer, and the moment was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening, only later, when you've had time to see what it was the beginning of. She turned back to the street. "Ruth wants to stay too," she said. "She mentioned something about building rather than teaching. I have some thoughts about what that could look like." "Tell me," she told him. The trial was held in Wichita 6 weeks later and lasted 4 days. They all went. Vivian, Ruth, Gideon, Margaret. Harlan stayed at the ranch with the hands, and James, which everyone understood without discussion, was Harlan's preference, and also probably the correct logistical decision. Of the 11 women Margaret had written to, 6 responded. 4 of those 4 came to Wichita. The other 2 sent written statements that Crane entered into the record. The women who came were between 24 and 41 years old, from Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas, and they had between them been waiting for somewhere to put what had happened to them for a combined total of somewhere over 30 years. Vivian met all 4 of them in the days before the trial, in the sitting room of the boarding house where Crane had arranged for them to stay together. She had expected these meetings to be difficult, and they were, but not in the way she'd anticipated. There was very little weeping. What there was, mostly, was talk. The particular talk of people who have been carrying a story with no audience and have suddenly found one, which comes out fast and in no particular order, doubling back and correcting itself and occasionally going sideways into something that had nothing to do with Dutton and everything to do with the years of life that had continued regardless. A woman named Dora from Indianapolis had opened a millinery shop. She showed Vivian a photograph of the shop front with the slightly self-conscious pride of someone who has accomplished something they're not sure they're allowed to be proud of. "He took everything I'd saved," Dora said. "So when I got home, I had to start over from the actual beginning, not from where I was, from zero." She looked at the photograph. "I was 27 and I had nothing, and I was so ashamed I couldn't eat properly for 6 months." She paused. "Now I have the shop and 3 people working for me, and I own the building outright." She folded the photograph carefully. "I don't know if I would have pushed that hard if I hadn't needed to. I was comfortable before. I thought comfortable was enough." Vivian thought about the life she'd been building in Boston. The organized, comfortable, not unhappy life. She thought about what Ruth had said, that she would rather build than teach fractions to children who might not stay. It wasn't enough, Vivian said, not to minimize what had been done to Dora, just as acknowledgement that the statement was true. "No," Dora said. It wasn't. The trial itself was different from what Vivian had expected, and she had expected it to be difficult. The defense attorney was a man named Beller, who had the particular competence of someone who has worked with limited material many times before and has developed efficient strategies for managing the limitation. He could not deny the documentation. Margaret's ledgers were waterproof, and Crane had organized them with a precision that left no room for alternative interpretation. What he could do, and did, was attempt to complicate the character of each woman who testified, because complicated character was his only available tool. When Vivian's turn came, she sat in the witness chair and looked at Beller with the steady attention she'd learned to maintain through 6 weeks of letter writing and one very long dinner in a dining room, and she let him work. He was not, she would admit later, unskilled. He found the points of genuine vulnerability. The fact that she had wired money before meeting Dutton in person. The fact that she had chosen to come west rather than exercising greater caution. The fact that a woman of her education and professional experience should perhaps have known better. "Should perhaps have known better," she repeated when he reached this point, calmly, without particular emphasis. "That's the question," Beller said. "You were not a naive young woman. You were educated, professionally experienced, financially capable." "Yes," she said. "And yet you wired a significant sum of money to a man you had never met." "I did." Without verification. Without sufficient verification. She paused. Mr. Beller, I'd like to ask you something if the court will permit it. She looked at the judge, who made a small gesture that she took as permission. In your professional experience, have you ever had a client who was defrauded by a con artist? Beller looked at her carefully. I've represented various clients, specifically someone who was targeted by a professional confidence scheme, a person who lost money to someone who had constructed a deliberate, practiced, sophisticated fiction over months of correspondence specifically designed to defeat normal caution. She let the question sit there. Have you ever met such a person and told them they should have known better? The question, she said, still calmly, is whether the damage done to me is real, regardless of what I should have known. And the answer to that question is in the ledger that your client's associate kept for 9 years. 23 names, Mr. Beller. 23 women across 9 years, all of whom should have known better, presumably. She looked at him. If all 23 of us failed at the same point with the same man using the same methods, I would suggest the reasonable interpretation is not that 23 educated women were each independently foolish, but that the method was specifically designed to defeat caution and was effective at doing so. The courtroom was very quiet. Beller moved on to something else. After the testimony, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Ruth found her and handed her a glass of water without comment, which was the right response. Gideon was at the end of the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized now, without needing to interpret it. The look of a man who has watched someone do something he found genuinely admirable and doesn't have the right words for it and isn't going to reach for wrong ones. Margaret testified on the third day. She was the last witness, and she sat in the chair with the composure of someone who has been rehearsing the truth for 3 years and is finally being asked to perform it. She spoke for 2 hours. She named the names, cited the records, traced the money through the accounts, with the precision of someone who had been a meticulous administrator in service of terrible purposes, and was now redirecting that meticulousness toward accounting for those purposes completely. Dutton sat at the defense table through all of it. He had not testified in his own defense, which Crane had predicted. He watched Margaret with the same face he'd worn in the hotel dining room when she first appeared. That complicated, tired recognition of a man who has arrived somewhere he always knew he might arrive and has no good response prepared because he spent his preparation time on other exits. He looked once at Vivian. She looked back. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply looked at him with the full and honest attention of a woman who had read his letters 6 times each and then taken 9 months to answer them correctly, and she held the look until he turned away first. The jury was out for 3 hours. They came back with conviction on all counts. It was October when they drove back to the ranch, and the Nebraska landscape had done what Nebraska does in October, turned itself into something that required no commentary. The grass golden and the sky, a hard, unreasonable blue, and the light doing the complicated things it did this time of year that still had no adequate names. Vivian sat in the wagon seat beside Gideon, and Ruth and Margaret were in the wagon bed, and nobody said much for the first several miles because there wasn't anything that needed saying yet. After a while, Ruth said from behind them, "What happens now?" It wasn't quite a question, more like an opening. "Now we build it," Vivian said. She had been working on this in the weeks before and during the trial, in whatever spaces she could find. Early mornings, the evenings when the boarding house went quiet. She had pages of notes that were not yet a plan but were becoming one. The shape of it had come to her in pieces, the way practical things usually do, not as an inspiration, but as a series of problems being solved one at a time until the solution had a form. The ranch had the space. The infrastructure was there, the house, the outbuildings, the established operation that generated enough income to support something additional. What she had in mind would require modification. A second kitchen or common room. Accommodation for women arriving with nothing, which meant simple but functional, not temporary feeling, because the difference between a place that feels like a rescue and a place that feels like a life mattered enormously. Work, real work, paid work, not charity, because the difference between being helped and being employed was the difference between being a patient and being a person. Bookkeeping, obviously. She could teach that. Ruth could establish an education program. Margaret, and this was the part she had turned over for a long time before arriving at it, Margaret, with her enforced knowledge of how fraudulent financial operations were constructed, was almost uniquely qualified to help women understand how to protect what they had, how to read a document, how to verify a claim, how to recognize the specific architecture of a lie built over months of careful correspondence. "I want to call it something plain," Vivian said, "not something grand." "The Shaw Ranch doesn't need a new name," Gideon said from beside her. "It could use a description." She looked at the road. "Something that says what it is." "Frontier Haven," Ruth said from behind. Vivian considered it. It was not, she admitted privately, the most subtle name she'd ever encountered. It was also accurate, which in her experience mattered more than subtlety in the long run. "Frontier Haven," she said. "All right." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to help build it." She said it plainly, without the particular weight of asking, which Vivian had come to understand was Margaret's way of making requests, stating them as intentions and leaving the response to the other party. "I know I'm not the obvious choice for a place designed to help women who have been harmed by people like—" She stopped. "People like I worked with." "People like you partly," Ruth said, not unkindly, just honestly. "Yes," Margaret said. "People like I partly was." She looked at the prairie going by. "That's why I might be useful. I know the inside of the thing." "You'll stay," Vivian said. It was not a question. "If you'll have me." "We'll have you." Gideon said nothing, which was his vote in favor of things he'd already thought through and decided. The first women arrived in November. Not many. 3, initially, all found through the network of correspondence that had continued in the wake of the trial. The Wichita paper had run a piece on the conviction that was, by the standards of frontier journalism, relatively accurate. Women had written to the address the paper mentioned. Some of the letters were from family members asking about daughters or sisters who had gone west and not been heard from. Some were from women themselves, in various states of stranded and furious and depleted, who had read about what happened in Caldwell Crossing and wanted to know if there was somewhere to go. Harlan managed the first 3 arrivals with exactly the same expression he managed everything: competent, quiet, unbothered. He showed them their rooms. He told them breakfast was at 6 and supper at 7, and if they had a problem with that, they could take it up with Vivian. He did not treat them as guests or as charity cases or as anything other than people who were now part of the household and would be expected to contribute to it in whatever way they could. By spring, they were 6. By the following autumn, 11. Ruth had established this education program, not just fractions, though James, who had by now developed an almost proprietary interest in the ranch's educational operations, still attended every session and had opinions about the curriculum. She had also begun teaching correspondence management, which was a more practical skill than it sounded: how to write a business letter, how to keep records, how to read a contract before signing it. Skills that women of the era were rarely taught because they were assumed to have men to do such things for them, and which turned out to be skills that women, once they had them, used immediately and with considerable effect. Margaret ran the financial literacy sessions. She was, Vivian would acknowledge to Ruth privately, better at it than almost anyone she'd encountered in any professional context. She had the particular gift of being able to explain complex financial concepts in terms that connected to the practical daily decisions people actually faced. She had also, in the months since the trial, developed a correspondence network with women's organizations in 4 states, through which she quietly passed along information about known fraud schemes and the men who ran them. It was informal and entirely without legal backing, but it was effective in the way that informal networks of information always are: distributed, fast-moving, difficult to suppress. Vivian ran the books, which was still her fundamental skill, and one she had no intention of giving up. And she also handled the growing administrative demands of an operation that was no longer primarily a cattle ranch with a subsidiary project, but something more genuinely hybrid. She had hired, in the spring, a young woman named Frances who had arrived in November with nothing and a facility for numbers that Vivian recognized immediately and began training without ceremony. Frances was quick. She was also mistrustful in the way of someone who has been disappointed in the specific place where trust was offered and has not yet fully determined that the current situation is different. Vivian did not push this. She gave Frances work and paid her for it and let the evidence accumulate at its own pace. By summer, Frances had moved from mistrustful to watchful. By autumn, she was teaching the basic bookkeeping session on Thursday afternoons with the slightly fierce competence of a person who has discovered they are good at something and intends to remain so. Gideon ran the cattle operation, which had continued throughout all of this and indeed provided much of the financial foundation that made everything else possible. He had expanded the herd in the spring, a decision that the reconciled books from 18 months earlier had suggested was feasible, and that turned out to be correct. He had also, without making a particular announcement of it, begun modifying the ranch's physical layout to accommodate the growing household. An addition to the north side of the main house that added 3 bedrooms, a separate common room in one of the outbuildings that had been converted for lessons and meetings, better lighting throughout the main house. He was not a demonstrative man. He never had been, and he didn't become one. What he was, increasingly clearly, was someone who thought about what the people around him needed before they asked for it, and then arranged for those things to exist. It was a form of attention that operated so quietly you could miss it if you weren't watching. Vivian was watching. One evening in late October, almost exactly 1 year after the trial, she found him at the south fence line, where he often went when he needed to think, looking out at the prairie that ran all the way to where the sky decided to begin. The light was doing the October thing, complicated and golden and too specific to name. She stood beside him. "Clara would have liked this," he said after a while. "What part?" "All of it." He looked at the ranch, the lights in the windows, the shape of the addition against the evening sky, the faint sound of voices from the common room where Ruth's Thursday session was running late, because it always ran late. She'd have probably run it better than any of us. "Probably," Vivian said. He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 4 years trying to find the man who killed her," he said. "That's how I thought about it, finding him. Like if I found him, the account would balance." He paused. "But that's not how accounts work. You know that." "No," she said. "They don't. The account doesn't balance. It has different entries now. The same loss on one side, and then all of this on the other side." He looked out at the prairie. "It doesn't cancel, but it counts." She thought about what she'd told Ruth in the hotel room in Caldwell Crossing, that stopping the next Clara was what it fixed. She thought about the ledger with 23 names and the column of outcome notations, and about Frances teaching bookkeeping on Thursday afternoons with her slightly fierce precision, and about Dora's photograph of the millinery shop she'd built from zero because she'd had to. She thought about what Dora had said, that she might not have pushed that hard if she hadn't needed to, that comfortable had not been enough. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "What I told you that first day, that I wanted to find him too." She looked at the fence line, at the prairie beyond it. "I thought I wanted justice. I thought that was the specific thing." She paused. "What I actually wanted was to stop being the woman who waited at the depot, to stop being the person that happened to." She turned to look at him. "And I don't know exactly when that stopped being true, but it's been a while." He looked at her. "When did it change?" She thought about it honestly. "The ledgers," she said. "The first week. When I found the discrepancy that wasn't a mistake and brought it to you and you told me what it was." She paused. "That was the first time I felt like I was doing something, rather than waiting for something to be done for me." She looked down at her hands, the ink stain on her right finger that was, at this point, simply part of the landscape of her hand. "After that, I don't think I waited for very much." "No," he said, "you didn't." There was a pause, the specific kind that happens between two people who have been circling something for a long time and have finally arrived at the edge of it. "I should have said something earlier," he said. "You said things," she said, "in the way you say things, which is the way where you arrange for what matters without explaining the arrangement." She looked at him. "I noticed." He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the thing she had first seen on a depot platform 11 months ago and had been reading with increasing accuracy ever since. Not romantic in the elaborate sense. Nothing performed or rehearsed. Just the genuine, unadorned attention of a person who has been looking at you for a long time and is not inclined to stop. "I fell in love with you somewhere in the middle of all of this," he said. "I couldn't tell you exactly when." "Neither could I," she said. "With you." He reached out and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture. His hand was large and calloused and warm and slightly uncertain, the hand of a man who doesn't do this often and is not performing ease about it. And she held it, and they stood at the south fence looking at the prairie as the October light finished its complicated work on the grass and the sky settled into the early dark. Behind them, through the walls of the common room, Ruth's session let out, and there was the sound of voices and movement, women moving through the evening toward supper, talking about the kinds of things people talk about when they have work and a roof and other people who expect to see them at breakfast. Ordinary things, small things, the kind of things that constitute a life rather than an interruption of one. The long table at supper that night held 14 people, which was more than it had been built for, and required 2 additional chairs borrowed from the study and a bench Willie had produced from somewhere in the barn without explanation. The food ran slightly short on one dish and compensated on another, which was Harlan's approach to abundance. Not perfection, just enough of the right things. James sat at the far end and ate with the focused absorption he'd had since the beginning and would probably have for the rest of his life, stopping occasionally to say something that required everyone within earshot to stop and think, which he seemed to understand was his particular contribution to the household and which he was not shy about exercising. Vivian sat in the middle of the table, which was where she usually sat now, close enough to both ends to hear most of what was happening, central in the way that made practical sense, rather than symbolic sense, which was the only kind of central she'd ever wanted to be. She ate, and she listened, and she talked. And at some point she looked down the table at the women who had arrived with nothing and were building something, and at the men who had let the building happen and pitched in when asked, and at Harlan, who had quietly moved his end of the table to accommodate 2 more chairs without anyone asking him to. And she thought, not in a way that required articulation, just the quiet, settled understanding of a person who has found the thing they were looking for after a long search in the wrong direction, that this was what she had come west for. Not Douglas Fairfield, not Eleanor Marsh, not even the trial, or the verdict, or the satisfaction of watching Clarence Dutton understand that he had walked into a trap built by the women he had discounted. This table, this work, this particular, imperfect, ongoing arrangement of people who had all arrived by difficult routes and decided to stay. After supper, washing dishes alongside Frances in the kitchen while Ruth argued cheerfully with Pete about something that had started as a question about geography and appeared to have migrated into a broader dispute about the nature of reliable information, Vivian thought about what Gideon had said at the fence. The account doesn't balance, but it counts. She had spent 6 years as a bookkeeper in Boston, and she understood, better than most, that balanced accounts were not the same as good ones. That what mattered was not whether the numbers came out even, but whether what they represented was true and useful and built toward something. She turned that over in her mind while the dishes got clean and the kitchen filled with the noise of an overcrowded household doing its ordinary evening things. And she decided that it was, as far as she could tell, the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. Not everything that gets taken from you can be returned. Not every loss finds its corresponding gain. The ledger of a life doesn't close with a clean balance. It just keeps running, entry after entry, the difficult ones and the ordinary ones and the ones you couldn't have predicted from the position where you started. What you do, she thought, is keep the records honestly. Show up for the work. Build what you can build with the people who show up to build it with you. And when someone whispers no more waiting, you decide, not because they told you to, but because you're ready, that the waiting is done. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She hung it back on its hook. She went back to the table where people were still talking, because there was more evening left and she intended to use it, and because the ranch was hers now in every way that mattered, and she was not